Hey friend, welcome back, or if this is your first time here, welcome for the very first time. Grab your blanket, find that perfect position on your pillow and let the world outside just fade away for a little while. Tonight I want to take you somewhere extraordinary. Imagine being born, and the first thing the world says about you is wrong. Not congratulations, not what a beautiful baby, just wrong. Wrong gender, wrong timing, wrong mother. Now imagine that same girl, the one the world rejected before she could even speak, growing up to become one of the most powerful monarchs in all of human history. And then at the height of her power, with kings and princes from across Europe literally lining up at her door to marry her, she looked at every single one of them and said, "No thank you, not once, not twice, 17 times. Tonight we're going to explore the life of a woman who was born unwanted, survived the unthinkable, and then turned her greatest wound into her greatest weapon. Her name was Elizabeth, and her story begins with a tragedy that happened before she was even old enough to understand what tragedy meant. But before we dive in, if you find yourself getting lost in this story tonight, if it touches something in you or makes you see history in a whole new way, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. Not because I am asking for a favor, but because when you do, it tells me that what I am making actually means something to you. And if you want to make my night even better, leave a comment. Tell me where you are right now. Are you in bed on the couch? Maybe halfway through a cup of tea that has already gone cold. I love knowing who's out there listening. Alright, turn the lights down low. Maybe put a fan on for some soft background noise. Let your body relax. And let us travel back together all the way to the year 1533. Greenwich Palace, England, September the 7th, 1533. It is a warm late summer evening and the entire kingdom of England has been holding its breath for months. King Henry VIII, a man so obsessed with having a male heir that he quite literally broke away from the Catholic Church, divorced his first wife of 24 years, and secretly married another woman just to try to get a son, is waiting. He had been so confident, so sure. His court astrologers had predicted a boy. His doctors had predicted a boy. He had already written the announcement. It literally said in the original draft, "The birth of a prince." And then the baby arrived. A girl? The announcement had to be corrected by hand. Someone crossed out the word prince and wrote princess in its place. That tiny correction, that single ink scratch on a piece of paper, tells you everything you need to know about the world this child was born into. Her name was Elizabeth, and from the very first breath she took, she was a disappointment. Now I want you to really sit with that for a moment, because we are not talking about a family that was just a little bit upset about getting a daughter instead of a son. We're talking about a king who had already moved heaven and earth, and I mean that almost literally, to ensure a male heir. Henry VIII had been married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, for about 24 years. She was a queen he genuinely respected. But she had only given him one surviving child, a daughter named Mary, and Henry had decided that was not enough. So he did something no English king had ever done before. He went to the Pope and asked for an annulment. The Pope refused, so Henry, in one of the most audacious power moves in all of European history, essentially said, "Fine, I will start my own church." The Church of England, created in no small part because a king wanted a different wife. That new wife was Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother. Anne was sharp, clever, charismatic in a way that made powerful men nervous. She had held Henry at arm's length for years, refusing to become his mistress like her sister before her, until he promised her the crown itself. And when Henry finally married her in 1533, the whole of Europe was scandalized. The Pope was furious. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, refused to give up her title of queen. It was chaos. All of this, every bit of it, was supposed to produce a son. And then Elizabeth arrived. Henry did not even attend the christening. Now here is where I want you to think about something that historians sometimes gloss over because they are focused on the political machinery, the treaties, the theology. But think about what it means for a child. Elizabeth would grow up knowing on some level that her very existence had been a disappointment to the most powerful man in England. She would grow up in a court where status could shift overnight, where the woman who was queen one year could be a prisoner the next. And she would grow up watching, and this is the part that I think shaped everything, she would grow up watching what happened to the women around her, starting with her own mother. Anne Boleyn lasted as Queen of England for roughly 3 years. 3 years! In that time she had 1 miscarriage, possibly 2. She failed to produce the son Henry desperately wanted, and Henry, who had burned the entire religious landscape of England to make her his queen, began to grow cold. By 1536, Anne was accused of adultery charges that most serious historians today believe were almost certainly fabricated. She was accused of having affairs with 5 men, including her own brother. The evidence was thin at best, coerced at worst, but the verdict was never really in doubt. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed at the Tower of London. Elizabeth was 2 years old and 8 months. 2 years old. She would not have understood what execution meant. She would not have understood that the mother who had held her, who had insisted on personally nursing her in those early weeks, which was actually quite unusual for a queen, was gone. Not gone as in travelling to another palace. Gone permanently, gone violently. What Elizabeth understood in those earliest years on some wordless bone-deep level is something that researchers in developmental psychology have spent decades trying to articulate. Children do not need to understand events intellectually to be shaped by them emotionally. The disappearance of a mother, the sudden shift in status because within days of Anne's execution, Elizabeth was also stripped of the title of princess. She went from being the king's recognised heir to being declared illegitimate overnight. She was not even 3 years old, and already the world had told her twice, "You are not enough. You do not fit. You do not belong." And this, my friends, is where I want to stop and offer you a thought, because I think it is crucial to everything that comes later. Most people, when they ask the question, why did Elizabeth never marry, look for the answer in her adult life. In the politics, in the suitors, in the speeches she gave to Parliament, and we will get to all of that. We absolutely will. But the seed, the very first seed of Elizabeth's complicated relationship with trust, with vulnerability, with the idea of giving another person power over your life, I believe it was planted right here, in the nursery at Hatfield House, where a little girl with red hair and her mother's dark eyes was growing up, knowing without being able to name it that love in her world could vanish without warning, that the people closest to a king were also the most exposed to his rage. That marriage, at least in the world she'd been born into, was not a sanctuary. It was a trap. Now Henry VIII would go on to marry 4 more times after Anne Boleyn. 6 wives in total, if you're keeping count. You probably know the mnemonic, right? Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But I want you to think about that not as a fun historical rhyme. I want you to think about it as Elizabeth's childhood, because Elizabeth lived through all of it. She watched her father cycle through women the way some people cycle through hobbies. Each new marriage brought a new stepmother, a new shift in court dynamics, a new recalculation of who was in favour and who was not. Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, and the one he perhaps loved most, genuinely died in 1537, just 12 days after giving birth to the son Henry had always wanted, Prince Edward. For a brief moment, Elizabeth had a baby brother. She also had briefly something that felt like a more stable court life. Jane Seymour had apparently been kind to Elizabeth and her older half-sister Mary, working to bring them both back into the royal family's orbit. And then Jane died, and stability evaporated again. By the time Elizabeth was 8 years old, she'd already experienced more upheaval than most people face in a lifetime. Her mother executed. Her own legitimacy declared and undeclared multiple times. Stepmothers appearing and disappearing. A father who was simultaneously the most powerful man in England, and by modern standards one of the most dangerous men in any child's life to depend upon emotionally. And yet, and this is what I find so extraordinary about Elizabeth, she did not break. She bent, she adapted, she learned. She learned to be brilliant at reading people, to watch facial expressions the way a chess grandmaster watches the board, to give nothing away while taking everything in. She became, from an almost impossibly young age, a student of survival. Her tutors noted that she was extraordinarily gifted, fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian by the time she was a teenager. She had a mind that her instructor, the scholar Roger Ascham, described as being like a man's understanding in a woman's body, which, yes, is a terribly backhanded compliment by our standards, but coming from a Tudor-era academic, it was essentially the highest praise imaginable. But here is what I think is equally important. Elizabeth was not just book-smart. She was emotionally intelligent in a way that her world barely had vocabulary for. She understood that in the court of Henry VIII, the only truly safe person was the one who needed nothing, who wanted nothing, who could not be threatened by loss, because they had already decided that attachment itself was dangerous. That is a heavy thing for a child to learn, and an even heavier thing to carry into adulthood. But before Elizabeth could even reach adulthood, she would face one more formative experience, one that would take everything she had already learned about danger and vulnerability and press it even deeper into her bones. We will get to that story in just a moment. But first I want to leave you with this image of 8-year-old Elizabeth, red hair, pale skin, already impeccably dressed because at the Tudor court appearance was armour, sitting in her rooms at one of the royal palaces, probably reading because books were the one place where the world made sense, where cause followed effect, where things meant what they said they meant. Outside her window, the political machinery of England was constantly grinding, and inside her head a little girl was already building something. Not walls exactly, but something more sophisticated than walls, a way of being in the world that kept her safe, that kept her whole, that kept her against every odds stacked against her alive. The question that would haunt her entire adult life, the question that kings and parliaments and nations would argue over for 45 years, was just beginning to take shape. Not will she marry, but something deeper than that. Can she trust anyone enough to let them in? Stay with me, friend, because what happened next, the story of a dangerous man, a secret that could have destroyed her, and a young girl's first real lesson in just how deadly closeness could be, is going to change everything you thought you understood about Elizabeth, and about why some of the most powerful people in history choose in the end to stand alone. Let me ask you something personal for a moment. Think back to the earliest memory you have. Maybe it's something small, the smell of rain, a voice calling your name, the feeling of being held. Now imagine that your earliest, clearest memory isn't warmth or safety. Imagine its absence. A door that never opens again. A name you're told never to say out loud. Elizabeth Tudor was 2 years 8 months old when her mother was taken to the Tower of London. She was not quite 3 when Anne Boleyn's head fell on the 19th of May, 1536. She was too young to understand what death was. But she was not too young to feel it. Here's what most history books give you the facts. Anne Boleyn was charged with adultery, incest, and high treason. She was found guilty almost certainly on fabricated evidence and executed at the Tower of London on a spring morning while birds were singing and London went about its business. Henry VIII had already moved on. He was engaged to Jane Seymour the day after Anne died. But facts don't tell you what it felt like to be the daughter left behind. Elizabeth didn't attend the execution. Of course she didn't. She was a toddler at Hatfield House, miles away, surrounded by servants who'd been instructed to say very little. But children absorb things. They absorb the tension in a room when adults go quiet. They absorb the way faces change when a certain name is mentioned. They absorb the sudden, unexplained disappearance of the one person who was supposed to be theirs. One day Anne Boleyn existed. The next day she simply didn't. And nobody explained why. Now I want to be honest with you about something because I think it matters. We don't have a record of Elizabeth sitting down as an adult and saying, "My mother's execution is why I never married." History is rarely that clean or that convenient. What we have instead is a pattern, a constellation of choices, fears, and behaviours that when you lay them side by side start to form a picture that is impossible to ignore. And one of the most striking pieces of that picture is this: Elizabeth almost never spoke about Anne Boleyn. In over 4 decades as Queen, in thousands of letters, speeches and documented conversations, Elizabeth referred to her mother only a handful of times. She wore a locket, a small hinged ring that opened to reveal tiny portraits of herself and Anne, and she wore it quietly, privately. Not as a declaration, as a secret. What does it mean when someone guards a wound that carefully psychologists who study childhood trauma, particularly what is now called ambiguous loss, the grief that comes not from a death with ceremony and closure, but from a disappearance, a silence, an explanation that never came, describe a very specific kind of damage? It doesn't look like obvious grief. It looks like control. It looks like self-sufficiency. It looks like a person who decides very early that depending on others is a form of danger. Sound familiar? There is a document from 1536 written by the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who served at the English court during those years. He noted almost in passing that after Anne's arrest, the young Elizabeth was quietly stripped of her title as heir to the throne. She went from being a princess, from being someone, to being legally defined as illegitimate, a bastard. The daughter of a woman the state had declared a criminal. She was 2 years old. Let that settle for a moment. Before she could read, before she could write, before she could fully understand what a mother was, Elizabeth had already learned the foundational lesson of her existence, that your value can be taken from you overnight, that the people who are supposed to protect you will not always do so. That love in the world she'd been born into was not a shelter, it was a liability. Her mother had loved Henry VIII, and that love had led her to the scaffold. There's a particular theory among Tudor historians, and I find it deeply compelling that Elizabeth's famous intellect, her extraordinary education, her relentless drive to be capable and self-contained, was not just ambition, it was armour. She began studying Latin at around 4 years old. By the time she was 12, she was fluent in 6 languages. At 14, she translated a poem from French into English as a New Year's gift for Catherine Parr, a poem that not coincidentally was about loss and perseverance. She devoured books on philosophy, rhetoric, theology. She trained herself to be someone no one could dismiss, no one could discard, no one could render powerless, because she had already seen what happened to a woman who was rendered powerless. Her father had called Anne Boleyn a witch, had whispered that he had been seduced by dark arts. He had rewritten the story so thoroughly that for a time even Anne's own daughter wasn't safe to acknowledge where she'd come from. Elizabeth learned something from that too. She learned that narrative is power, that the person who controls the story controls everything. And years later, when she stood before Parliament and refused calmly, brilliantly, absolutely to be defined by her husband's name, she was doing exactly what her mother had never been allowed to do. She was controlling her own story. Now here is where I want to push back gently against the most romantic version of this history, because I think we owe Elizabeth more than sentimentality. Some writers and filmmakers portray Elizabeth's reluctance to marry as pure tragic longing, a woman wounded by love forever reaching for something she cannot quite touch. It's beautiful. It's also, I think, a little too simple, because there is another possibility, and it's one that Elizabeth herself hinted at in various moments throughout her reign. The possibility that she genuinely, rationally, strategically concluded that marriage was a bad deal. Think about what marriage meant for a woman in the 16th century, even especially a queen. It meant legal subordination. It meant that her husband became, in the eyes of law and custom, the dominant authority. It meant that England, her England, the kingdom she had fought to survive, long enough to rule, could pass into the hands of a man she might not fully trust. Her sister Mary had married Philip II of Spain, and England had found itself dragged towards Spanish interests, Spanish wars, Spanish ambitions. Elizabeth had watched that happen from close range. She had drawn her conclusions. So when you ask why Elizabeth never married, you are really asking two separate questions at once. There is the emotional question: what did her mother's fate do to the girl who grew up without her? And there is the political question: what did power teach the woman who eventually held it? The answer to both, I believe, lives in the same place, in a small private locket, in a name spoken only in whispers, in a child who learned before she could tie her own shoes, that the world does not protect the women who trust it completely. What strikes me most every time I go back to this period of Elizabeth's life is how alone she was in processing it. There was no language in the 16th century for childhood trauma. There was no framework for what it meant to lose a parent to political violence. You were simply expected to carry on, to not make it strange, to fold the wound into yourself and present a composed face to a court that was watching for weakness. Elizabeth did that, remarkably, almost unnervingly well. But here's the thing about wounds that are folded inward rather than tended to: they don't disappear. They migrate. They show up in unexpected places, in patterns of behavior that persist for decades, in decisions that seem rational on the surface but carry something older and heavier underneath. And in the chapters ahead we're going to see exactly how that wound migrated, because what happened next in Elizabeth's childhood didn't give it time to heal. It made it infinitely worse. Because just a few years after losing her mother, a man entered her life who was supposed to be a protector, a trusted figure, a family connection. Instead, Thomas Seymour would become something else entirely, and the experience would leave a mark on the teenage Elizabeth that historians are still debating 4.5 centuries later. Let's go there now. There are certain stories in history that make you genuinely uncomfortable. Not because they are gory or dramatic in the Hollywood sense, but because they are quietly, deeply wrong in a way that takes a moment to fully land. The story of Thomas Seymour and the teenage Elizabeth is one of those stories, and I want to tell it carefully because it deserves care. Not sensationalism, not the breathless, salacious retelling it sometimes gets, but genuine clear-eyed attention, because what happened in the years between 1547 and 1549 almost certainly shaped the woman Elizabeth would become, in ways that no coronation, no war, no political crisis ever could. Let's set the scene properly. Henry VIII died in January of 1547. Elizabeth was 13 years old. Her half-brother Edward, 9 years old, frail and destined to reign for only 6 years, became King Edward VI. And into this new uncertain world stepped 2 brothers who had been circling power for years, waiting for exactly this moment. The elder brother was Edward Seymour, who made himself Lord Protector and effectively ran the country on the child king's behalf. The younger brother was Thomas Seymour, and Thomas Seymour was by every historical account extraordinarily charming, extraordinarily ambitious, and extraordinarily dangerous, in the specific way that only very charming, very ambitious men can be. Within weeks of Henry's death, Thomas Seymour secretly married Catherine Parr, Henry's widow, the woman who'd been stepmother to Elizabeth. This was already scandalous by the standards of the time. The ink on the old king's death record was barely dry, but Thomas was not a man who waited, And here is where Elizabeth enters the picture. Catherine Parr invited the young princess to come live in her household at Chelsea. It was a kind gesture Catherine genuinely cared for. Elizabeth had advocated for her education, had been one of the few stable presences in a childhood defined by instability. Elizabeth accepted. She moved in. She was 13, then 14, living in a wealthy household with her beloved stepmother and her stepmother's new husband. What happened next is documented not in rumour or gossip, but in formal testimony, given during a government investigation in 1549. Servants testified. Ladies-in-waiting testified. Elizabeth's own governess, Catherine Ashley, gave a statement that is still preserved in historical records today. Thomas Seymour, a man in his late 30s, began entering Elizabeth's bedchamber in the early mornings, before she was dressed, before her ladies were fully present. He would pull back the curtains of her bed. He tickled her. He slapped her on what the records delicately describe as the buttocks. On one occasion, Catherine Parr herself participated, held Elizabeth still, while Thomas cut her dress into pieces in the garden, laughing, framing it as a game. I need you to sit with that for a second. This was not flirtation between equals. This was not a romantic subplot in a period drama. This was a powerful adult man, a man with political connections, a man whom the household depended upon, deliberately repeatedly crossing boundaries with the teenage girl who had no meaningful way to stop him. The fact that it was sometimes framed as playful, as humorous, as just Thomas being Thomas, that framing is itself part of the problem. Elizabeth's governess eventually complained. She told Thomas to stop visiting the bedchamber. He largely ignored her. Catherine Parr, to her credit, eventually recognized that something was wrong. She sent Elizabeth away from the household in 1548. The two of them exchanged letters afterward, warm, careful, affectionate letters, and you can feel in them the particular strain of a situation that nobody quite had the language to address directly. Catherine Parr died in September of 1548 from complications following childbirth. She was 36 years old, and Thomas Seymour, freed from even that thin constraint, began making moves that were breathtaking in their audacity. Here's where it gets genuinely alarming from a political standpoint, because Thomas Seymour wasn't just a man with poor judgment around young women. He was a man with an agenda. After Catherine's death, he began pursuing the idea of marrying Elizabeth himself. He was already corresponding with her household, sending her money through channels that bypassed proper court oversight, a significant legal violation, since Elizabeth was a royal ward whose financial affairs were controlled by the Privy Council. He allegedly told associates that he intended to marry her. He positioned himself politically as though this was simply a matter of when, not if. He was also simultaneously plotting to undermine his own brother's authority as Lord Protector, attempting to gain direct control over the young king, and stockpiling weapons and money at Holt Castle. The man was not subtle. In January of 1549, Thomas Seymour was arrested. The charges against him were extensive treason, conspiracy, unauthorized contact with royal heirs. He was questioned about his conduct with Elizabeth in exhaustive detail, and those questions landed directly on the 15-year-old princess like a storm she had not been warned about. This is the part of the story I find most revealing about who Elizabeth already was at 15. She was interrogated by Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, a skilled government examiner sent specifically to extract a confession from her, a confession that Thomas had proposed marriage, that she had encouraged him, that they had perhaps even made secret agreements. If Elizabeth admitted to any of this, it could have been framed as treason. The consequences could have been severe. Tyrwhitt wrote back to the Protector visibly frustrated. He reported that Elizabeth was extraordinarily careful with her words, that she gave nothing away, that she was, and this is his word, marvellously controlled for someone her age. She was 15 years old and being interrogated by a government official in a political climate where saying the wrong thing could genuinely end her. And she held the line. She acknowledged what was documented and could not be denied. She denied what could not be proven. She was precise, composed, and relentlessly careful. I don't tell you this to suggest Elizabeth was calculating in a cold or cynical way. I tell you this because I think it speaks to something extraordinary about her character, that the trauma, the fear, the genuine danger of her position had already produced in her, a quality of self-possession that most adults never fully develop. She had learned out of sheer necessity how to survive inside a system designed by men operated by men, and deeply suspicious of her simply for existing. Thomas Seymour was executed in March of 1549. When Elizabeth was told, she reportedly said very little. One of her ladies recalled that she received the news quietly and then moved on with her day. Some historians read that as coldness. I read it differently. I think she'd already grieved what needed to be grieved, the loss of safety, the loss of a household she had loved, the loss of Catherine Parr, the loss of whatever uncomplicated sense of trust she might still have carried from childhood. By the time Seymour died, there was nothing left of that chapter to mourn. Now here is the question I genuinely sit with when I think about this period of Elizabeth's life. What does it do to a girl already carrying the absence of a mother she was never allowed to properly grieve, already having watched powerful women destroyed by the men they were attached to, when the first adult man who holds power over her household uses that power to make her feel unsafe in her own bedroom? There is no clean answer. But there is a pattern that emerges in the years that follow. Elizabeth would spend her entire adult life cultivating relationships with men entirely on her own terms. She would charm them, she would manage them, she would keep them strategically close, but she would never, not once, surrender the kind of authority over her own person and her own space that Thomas Seymour had so casually invaded when she was 14. Some people call that coldness, some people call it calculation. I call it a very rational response to a very specific education. She emerged from the Seymour affair not broken but altered, sharpened perhaps, more careful about the distance between what she showed and what she felt, more aware that in the world she inhabited trust was not a gift you gave freely, it was a resource you managed like grain in a winter storehouse. She was 15. She'd already lived 3 lifetimes, and the hard seasons were far from over. Because while Elizabeth was navigating the aftermath of the Seymour scandal, learning to keep her face composed and her words precise, something else was building in England, a shift in the political weather that would eventually put her in a place far darker and far colder than any difficult household. It would put her in the Tower of London, the same tower where her mother had spent her last days on earth. And in that damp, stone-walled silence, Elizabeth would learn the final, most essential lesson of her survival, that power, real power, has to be seized and held with both hands, and that anyone who asks you to soften your grip is probably the person you should trust least. That chapter is next. Picture this. It is a cold, grey morning in March of 1554. A barge moves slowly along the River Thames, cutting through water the colour of slate. On board sits a young woman of 20 years old, wrapped against the chill, her face giving nothing away to the guards surrounding her. She knows where she's being taken. She has known since the orders arrived. And as the barge rounds the bend and the Tower of London comes into full view, those ancient heavy walls rising from the river bank like something out of a nightmare, she does something that the boatman will remember for years afterward. She asks to stop. She refuses for a moment to step off the boat. Not out of cowardice, out of something far more complicated, because Elizabeth Tudor knew with complete clarity that the last woman who had passed through the tower's water entrance had been her mother, and her mother had not come back out. The guards eventually persuaded her. She stepped onto the stone landing. She sat down on the wet steps and, according to one account from a gentleman attending her, said quietly, "It is better sitting here than in a worse place." Even in that moment, even at that threshold, she found her footing. To understand why Elizabeth ended up in the Tower, we need to go back briefly, not to retread ground we've already covered, but to pick up the specific thread of her sister Mary's reign, which began in 1553, and which turned England inside out almost immediately. Mary I, Bloody Mary, as history rather brutally nicknamed her, was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. She was deeply, fervently Catholic, and when she took the throne after the brief chaotic reign of Lady Jane Grey, she began systematically reversing the Protestant reforms that had reshaped England over the previous 2 decades. Nearly 300 Protestants were burned during her reign. The religious tension in England was not abstract or theoretical, it was visceral, it was daily, and it was political. And Elizabeth, whether she wanted to be or not, had become a symbol. She was Protestant by upbringing and education. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman whose marriage to Henry had triggered the English break with Rome in the first place. To Catholic loyalists, Elizabeth's very existence was a provocation. To Protestant dissenters chafing under Mary's rule, Elizabeth was something they desperately needed: a figurehead, an alternative, a future. She'd not asked for any of this. She was 20 years old and trying very hard to stay alive by staying invisible. She attended Catholic Mass. She wrote careful deferential letters to her sister. She was on the surface the model of obedience, but you cannot always control what people do with your name. In January of 1554, a rebellion broke out. Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger led an uprising in Kent ostensibly to protest Mary's planned marriage to Philip II of Spain, though the religious undercurrent was unmistakable. The rebellion failed, Wyatt was captured, and under interrogation his questioners pushed hard on one particular subject: had Elizabeth been involved? Had she known? Had she given any encouragement, any signal, any correspondence? Wyatt, to his credit, and probably at some cost to himself, maintained that Elizabeth had nothing to do with it. He said so publicly even at his own execution. It didn't fully matter. The damage to Elizabeth's position was done. The Spanish ambassador, who despised her and had been lobbying for her removal for years, pushed Mary's counsel hard. Elizabeth was summoned to court, questioned, and then, after several agonizing weeks, during which her fate genuinely hung in the balance, sent to the Tower. She spent approximately 2 months imprisoned there, from March to May of 1554. 2 months does not sound very long until you understand the specific texture of those 2 months. She did not know when she would be released. She did not know if she would be released. Her servants were restricted. Her correspondence was monitored. Every word she wrote, every visitor she received, every request she made passed through layers of official scrutiny. She was 20 years old, living in the same stone complex where her mother had been held and then killed, surrounded by guards, whose loyalty was not to her, under a sister whose advisers were actively arguing for her execution. And she survived it by being, in the most precise and technical sense of the phrase, impossible to pin down. Here is what I find genuinely remarkable about Elizabeth's conduct during those 2 months and the weeks of interrogation that preceded them. She was questioned repeatedly about the Wyatt rebellion, about her correspondence, about a letter she had written to Mary that her interrogators found suspicious in its wording, and Elizabeth again and again gave answers that were careful to the point of being almost maddening. She acknowledged what was documented. She questioned the interpretation of what was ambiguous. She asked at one point to be allowed to speak directly with her sister, a request that was denied. One of her examiners, Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, and one One of the most skilled political operators of the age reportedly came away from his sessions with her frustrated, not because she was evasive in an obvious way, but because she was precise, because she understood instinctively and completely that in a system looking for reasons to condemn her, every unnecessary word was a gift to her enemies. There is a letter she wrote to Mary from the tower it survives today, and historians call it simply the Tide Letter, because she wrote it while waiting for the tide on the Thames to be right for her transport, and she wrote it in such a way that it could not be used against her. She asked for the chance to speak in person. She insisted on her innocence with firmness but without aggression. She was in that letter performing a kind of verbal tightrope walk that would have been impressive from a seasoned diplomat. She was 20. Now I want to offer you a thought that I don't see discussed often enough because I think it reframes everything that comes after. The Tower experience didn't just teach Elizabeth that power was dangerous. She already knew that she had known it since childhood, since her mother, since the Seymour affair. What the Tower taught her in a way that was almost viscerally physical was what it felt like to have no control, to be entirely at the mercy of someone else's decision, to wake up each morning not knowing whether that day would bring release or something far worse. And I genuinely believe, having spent a lot of time with this history, that she decided somewhere in those damp stone rooms that she would never allow herself to be in that position again, that she would never hand anyone the kind of authority over her fate that Mary currently held, that she would structure her entire life going forward around the preservation of her own agency. Think about what that means for the question of marriage. Marriage in the 16th century was the single most complete legal transfer of a woman's autonomy that existed. When Elizabeth eventually became queen, her advisers and Parliament would tell her repeatedly that she needed a husband, that England needed an heir, that a queen regnant a woman ruling in her own right rather than as a king's consort was an anomaly, a gap in the natural order, a source of instability. What they were actually asking her to do, though she would never have phrased it this way, was to climb back into a cage. A comfortable cage, perhaps. A politically advantageous cage. But a cage nonetheless. And Elizabeth Tudor had just spent 2 months in the Tower of London, having come closer to losing everything than most people ever come in a lifetime because of a system that treated women as pieces to be moved around a board by men with more authority. She had learned the lesson that system was trying to teach her. She had simply drawn a different conclusion than the one her teachers intended. She was released from the Tower in May of 1554, transferred to house arrest at Woodstock in Oxfordshire. She spent almost a year there under the supervision of Sir Henry Bedingfield, a loyal Marian official, who by most accounts was a decent enough man doing an awkward job. Elizabeth reportedly tested his patience with requests, complaints, and the occasional flash of imperious dignity that she was already developing into a fine art. There are small, almost funny stories from Woodstock. She scratched words into a window pane with a diamond ring. Much suspected by me nothing proved can be, which is either a genuinely defiant moment of personal expression or extremely good political theatre, and possibly both. She asked Bedingfield for books for writing materials for access to a garden. She negotiated the small parameters of her captivity with the careful persistence of someone who had learned that you fight for every inch of freedom available to you, because that's what the Tower had given her beyond the trauma and the fear, and the very real possibility of a far worse outcome clarity, about what mattered, about what she was willing to do to survive, about the kind of queen she would be if she ever got the chance. Mary I died in November of 1558 without an heir after a reign defined largely by grief and disappointment. Elizabeth was at Hatfield House when the news reached her. She was 25 years old. She had outlasted everyone who had tried to remove her. She had survived her father's contempt, her brother's indifference, her sister's suspicion, 2 government investigations and 2 months in a tower that was a monument to what happened to women who lost. She walked out to greet the delegation that arrived to tell her she was queen, and according to people present, she knelt on the grass, this composed, careful, guarded young woman, and she quoted Psalm 118 in Latin. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes." She knew exactly what she'd survived to reach this moment, and that knowledge, that bone-deep earned expensive knowledge of what it cost to be powerless, would sit at the centre of every decision she made for the next 45 years, including, and perhaps especially, the decision that history would spend centuries arguing about. Because now she was queen, and now the proposals would begin arriving from every corner of Europe, kings and princes and dukes and earls, all with their own ambitions and their own agendas and their own assumptions about what a young queen would want and need. What none of them fully understood was that they weren't just proposing marriage to a woman. They were proposing it to someone who had attended the School of Survival since before she could read, and who had graduated at the top of her class. The suitors were about to discover one by one exactly how good a student she'd been, and we're going to meet them, all of them right now, starting with the one who arrived first, who offered the most, and who perhaps understood her least of all. So she was queen. November of 1558. Elizabeth Tudor, 25 years old, stood at the beginning of what would become one of the longest and most consequential reigns in English history. And almost immediately before the coronation had even been planned, before the new government had fully taken shape, the pressure started. Marry, produce an heir, secure the succession, find a husband. It came from Parliament. It came from her own Privy Council. It came from foreign ambassadors reporting back to their kings. It came in various forms for the next 3 decades. And Elizabeth's response to that pressure, the way she managed it, shaped it, and ultimately weaponized it, is one of the most fascinating political performances in the entire history of Western monarchy. But here is the question I want to sit with today, because I think it's more interesting than the simple either-or that history sometimes presents. Was the image of the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the untouchable, the woman married only to England, was that a choice born of genius? Or was it a wound dressed up so beautifully that it eventually looked like a crown? I think honestly it was both. And the fact that it was both is what makes Elizabeth so extraordinary. Let's talk about the political architecture first, because it genuinely was brilliant, and I say that not as flattery, but as a factual assessment of what she built and how long it lasted. When Elizabeth came to the throne, England was a second-tier European power with a currency in crisis, a population exhausted by religious whiplash, and a recent military humiliation, the loss of Calais to France in January of 1558, the last English territory on the continent which had been held for over 200 years. Her sister's reign had been by most measures a disaster. The treasury was strained. The Spanish alliance that Mary had purchased through her marriage to Philip II had cost England dearly in blood and treasure, and had produced nothing of lasting value. Elizabeth inherited all of this, and she was a woman, in a world that had at best a complicated relationship with the idea of female authority. Her first move, and this is the part that I genuinely admire, was to reframe the entire conversation. Instead of accepting the premise that her gender was a liability to be managed, she began slowly and deliberately constructing a narrative in which her gender was an asset. An extraordinary one. She was not just a queen. She was something singular, something England had never quite seen before. She was, and she cultivated this image with tremendous intentionality, a figure who transcended the ordinary categories of woman and ruler and became something almost mythological. The imagery that surrounded her court began to shift. Portraits showed her not as a young woman in need of a husband's protection, but as an almost otherworldly figure, pale, jewelled, blazing with symbolism. The rainbow portrait painted around 1600 when she was in her late 60s shows her as eternally young, holding a rainbow, wearing a cloak covered in eyes and ears. She sees everything. She knows everything. She's connected to the heavens in a way that ordinary mortals are not. The eyes and ears on that cloak, by the way, are not decorative. They are a message. To her court, to her enemies, to anyone watching, I am always informed. Do not underestimate me. That is not vanity. That is statecraft. Now, the specific language of the Virgin Queen, the idea that Elizabeth had consecrated herself to England in a kind of secular religious devotion, this emerged gradually rather than all at once, and I think that gradual emergence tells us something important. In the early years of her reign, Elizabeth did not categorically refuse to marry. She kept suitors in play sometimes for years with a skill that her council found maddening, and that modern political analysts would probably recognize as masterful negotiation. She was never quite available, but she was never quite unavailable either. She existed in a permanent, carefully maintained state of almost. And that almost was immensely valuable. As long as Elizabeth might marry foreign powers had reason to court England's favour, the French had a candidate, the Spanish had a candidate, the Austrians had a candidate, the English nobility had candidates. Each of them needed to stay on Elizabeth's good side to present their best diplomatic face to offer concessions and alliances and trade advantages in the hope of eventually securing the prize she never intended to give. This is the part where I want to offer my own reading, and I acknowledge it's a reading, not a certainty, because Elizabeth was careful enough that certainty is rarely available. But I believe that by the mid-1560s, perhaps even earlier, Elizabeth had already concluded internally that she would not marry, that the question was not if but how to manage the appearance of possibility for as long as politically useful, and the evidence, I think, is in the pattern of her rejections. They were too consistent, too perfectly timed, too strategically convenient in their outcomes to be simply the result of a woman who hadn't yet found the right man. Take the case of Archduke Charles of Austria, the younger son of Emperor Ferdinand I. He was proposed as a match beginning around 1563 and remained on the table, if you'll forgive the expression, for almost 5 years. The negotiations were detailed, the correspondence was extensive, the diplomatic machinery cranked along, and then at the precise moment when a firm answer could no longer be avoided, Elizabeth raised an insurmountable objection, the question of religion. Charles was Catholic. Elizabeth would not require him to convert, but she would not permit him to practice his faith privately at the English court either. This was on its face a perfectly reasonable Protestant position. It was also, as everyone involved quietly understood, a perfectly effective way to kill a negotiation without being the one seen to kill it. She did this repeatedly, with remarkable consistency. The objection was always just legitimate enough to be defensible. The timing was always just right to avoid the moment of actual commitment. You could call that fortunate coincidence, or you could call it what it was, a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. But here, and this is where I want to complicate the genius narrative a little here, is where the personal wound and the political calculation become genuinely difficult to separate. Because the Virgin Queen imagery was not purely cynical. It carried real emotional weight for Elizabeth, and I think she felt that weight even as she was also using it strategically. There is a speech she gave to Parliament in 1563 when they were pressing her particularly hard about the succession. She said, and this is one of the most striking things any monarch of that era ever said publicly, "I am already bound unto a husband which is the kingdom of England." She told them she had made her choice, that her coronation ring was her wedding ring, that the people of England were her children. Now. You can read that as pure theatre, brilliant rhetoric for a political moment. But what if she also meant it? What if by 1563, 5 years into her reign, having governed and survived and built something extraordinary largely on her own terms, what if England genuinely had become the relationship that gave her life its meaning and structure? What if the marriage metaphor wasn't just a metaphor? I find myself believing that it wasn't. And that is what elevates Elizabeth from merely clever to genuinely tragic in the Greek sense, someone whose greatest strength and greatest wound are the same thing expressed through the same choices. Her image management was extraordinary in its detail, and I want to give you a specific example that most people don't know about because it illustrates how total her control of this narrative was. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth commissioned and approved portraits under tight supervision. She issued proclamations against unflattering portraits. There are documented instances of portraits being recalled or destroyed because they did not meet her standards. What she was managing was not mere vanity. She was managing the living, breathing visual mythology of the Virgin Queen. Every image that circulated of her was a diplomatic document, a statement of power, a carefully composed argument about who and what she was. Compare this to almost any other monarch of the period. Philip II of Spain, for instance, his portraits vary considerably across his reign, aging with him, showing him as a man subject to time. Elizabeth's official portraits, especially from the 1580s onward, depict someone who appears to exist outside of time. She gets younger, if anything, as the decades pass. The settings become more symbolic, less naturalistic. She's becoming less a person and more an idea. That transformation was deliberate, and it required a level of self-awareness and narrative control that frankly most rulers, male or female, then or now, never achieve. There is a moment I keep coming back to, though, that cuts through all the political genius and the myth-making and the brilliant strategy. It is a small moment, almost nothing recorded by one of her ladies in waiting, sometime in the 1590s when Elizabeth was in her 60s. She was looking at a portrait of herself, an early one from when she was young, and she said quietly to no one in particular that she had been some beauty once. Just that. Just those few words with whatever was behind them. I don't know what she was thinking in that moment. Nobody does. But when I read it, I don't see a queen reviewing her political portfolio. I see a woman getting older, looking at a young face she used to inhabit, thinking about roads not taken perhaps, or simply remembering. The Virgin Queen was a construction, one of the most brilliant political constructions in the history of the English monarchy, but inside that construction was a person who had made choices, some forced upon her, some freely made, and some impossible to cleanly categorize as either. And the deeper we go into the story of those choices, the more complicated and the more human she becomes. Speaking of complicated and human, we haven't yet talked about the man who came closest. The one person in Elizabeth's adult life who seemed to reach past all the armour, past the mythology, past the carefully managed performance of the Virgin Queen, and touch something real. His name was Robert Dudley. He was her master of the horse, her oldest friend, the man whose face she reportedly wanted to see first every morning. And the story of what they were to each other and why it still ended the same way every other proposal ended is perhaps the most revealing chapter in the entire question of why Elizabeth never married. That story begins right now. Every great story has that one character, the one who gets closer than anyone else, the one who makes you think maybe this time, maybe this person, maybe this is where the wall finally comes down. For Elizabeth Tudor, that person was Robert Dudley. And I want to be upfront with you from the start. This is the chapter of Elizabeth's life that historians have argued about for 4.5 centuries. victories that novelists have romanticized, that filmmakers have dramatized, and that still, even now, even with all the scholarship and all the distance, feels unresolved. Because it is unresolved. The full truth of what Elizabeth and Robert Dudley were to each other lives in that particular shadow where history and the human heart overlap, and where certainty is simply not available. What we do have are facts, and the facts arranged honestly tell a story that is more moving than most fiction. Robert Dudley and Elizabeth Tudor had known each other since childhood. This is not a small detail, it is the foundation of everything. They were close in age, Dudley born in 1532, Elizabeth in 1533, and they had crossed paths in the royal household as children. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, but too perfectly symbolic to ignore entirely, that they were even imprisoned in the Tower at the same time in 1554, Elizabeth awaiting her fate. Under Mary's suspicion, Dudley imprisoned for his family's role in the Lady Jane Grey affair. Whether they actually spoke during those overlapping months of captivity, nobody knows, but the image is almost unbearably resonant. Two young people, both 20 years old, both facing the real possibility that they would not survive the seasons, separated by stone walls in the same ancient complex. Both of them waiting, both of them holding on. He survived, she survived, and when Elizabeth became queen 4 years later, one of her first significant appointments was to make Robert Dudley her Master of the Horse, a prestigious position that kept him close physically and politically, at the very centre of her court. The talk started almost immediately. By 1559, just months into Elizabeth's reign, the Spanish ambassador Álvaro de la Cuadra was reporting back to Philip II with barely concealed alarm. He wrote that Elizabeth was with Dudley constantly, that she visited his chamber, that she had apparently said, and this is extraordinary given her position, that if she ever chose to marry an Englishman it would be him. Now, ambassadors of this era were not neutral observers. They had agendas, they exaggerated, they interpreted through the lens of what their masters wanted to hear. So we hold those reports with appropriate caution. But the sheer volume and consistency of the commentary, from multiple ambassadors, from English courtiers, from foreign observers with no shared agenda, makes it impossible to dismiss entirely. Something was visible. Something was happening that people around them could see, even if they couldn't fully read it. What complicated everything immediately and catastrophically was the fact that Robert Dudley already had a wife, Amy Robsart. They had married in 1550, a genuine love match, by the accounts of the time when Dudley was 18 and Amy was 17. By 1559, however, Amy was rarely at court. She was unwell suffering, it was later established, from what was almost certainly breast cancer, though that diagnosis obviously wasn't available to anyone at the time. She lived largely in the countryside, moving between the houses of friends while her husband orbited the Queen in London. The situation was uncomfortable by any measure, and then in September of 1560 it became a scandal that shook Europe. Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place in Oxfordshire. She was 28 years old. The circumstances were deeply strange. It was a Sunday. The household had been given the day off to attend a local fair, an unusual decision that Amy herself had apparently insisted upon, reportedly sending even her closest attendant away. So when her body was discovered that evening at the foot of the stairs with her neck broken and her headdress still perfectly in place, there were essentially no witnesses and no clear explanation. The coroner's jury returned a verdict of accidental death, but rumours spread across Europe within weeks. Dudley's enemies, and he had many because he was brilliant and ambitious, and the Queen clearly favoured him, which is a combination that generates enemies efficiently. His enemies said he had arranged it, that he had cleared the house deliberately, that he had removed the obstacle between himself and the throne. There were others who suggested more quietly that Amy might have taken her own life. She was seriously ill-isolated, aware that her husband's attention had been entirely captured by the most powerful woman in England. The historical consensus today, shaped partly by forensic analysis of the available records, leans toward accidental death, possibly a fall made more likely by the physical effects of advanced breast cancer on bone density. But the case has never been definitively closed, and the murkiness was politically devastating regardless of the truth. Because here is the problem Elizabeth now faced, and it was a problem that no amount of personal feeling could dissolve. If she married Dudley in the wake of Amy's death, half of Europe would conclude she had been complicit in it. Her legitimacy as a ruler, already challenged by those who questioned a woman's right to govern, would be shredded. The narrative would write itself the queen, and her favourite removing an inconvenient wife to clear the path to power. She could not marry him. Not then. Possibly not ever, given how thoroughly the scandal had contaminated the possibility. And I think Elizabeth knew this the moment she heard the news. One of her ladies reported that the Queen received the information about Amy's death with an expression that was impossible to read, which, if you've followed Elizabeth's story this far, tells you something, because by this point in her life, when Elizabeth's expression was impossible to read, it usually meant she was feeling something very deeply indeed. What happened to the relationship between Elizabeth and Dudley after 1560 is one of the most fascinating long-game stories in the entire Tudor period. They did not separate. If anything, Dudley's position at court became more entrenched, more formally recognised. In 1564, Elizabeth created him Earl of Leicester, a significant elevation that gave him the rank and status that might make him a plausible consort. She reportedly wept during the ceremony, which is the kind of detail that makes you stop and set down whatever you're reading for a moment. She also, in one of the most bizarre and revealing episodes of her entire reign, proposed Dudley as a husband for Mary Queen of Scots. Yes, you read that correctly. Elizabeth proposed the man she was personally closest to. The man the whole of Europe assumed she loved as a match for her political rival and cousin. Mary, understandably, was not particularly flattered by the offer. But think about what this tells us about Elizabeth's internal architecture. She could not have Dudley herself. The political cost was too high, the scandal too fresh, the risks too great. But she could perhaps convert that impossible personal situation into a diplomatic tool. She could offer him in a way that kept him connected to her orbit, since a Scottish king would still need English cooperation, while simultaneously solving the problem of Mary's unmarried status and the succession pressures it created. It was either a masterstroke of cold calculation or the most heartbreaking thing she ever did. Possibly both. I keep arriving at that conclusion with Elizabeth, that the most heartbreaking moments and the most brilliant strategic moments were for her often the exact same moment. Mary eventually refused and married Henry Stuart Lord Darnley instead. That marriage was famously a catastrophe. But that is Mary's story, and we are here for Elizabeth's. Dudley remained in Elizabeth's life for nearly 30 years after Amy's death. He was her constant companion, her trusted advisor, her something. English doesn't quite have the word for what he was to her, which is itself telling. He was too close to be a mere favourite, too politically consequential to be merely personal, too entangled in everything she was and did to be categorised cleanly. He married again in 1578 secretly, Lettice Knollys, a cousin of Elizabeth's, a woman whose beauty and confidence reportedly mirrored the Queen's own. When Elizabeth found out, she was furious in a way that went beyond political displeasure. She banished Lettice from court permanently. She reportedly raged at Dudley in terms that her courtiers found alarming in their intensity. You do not rage like that about a political ally. You rage like that about something that cuts into a much older, much deeper wound. She forgave him eventually. She always forgave him. That too is revealing. He died in September of 1588, just weeks after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the greatest military triumph of Elizabeth's reign, a moment of national celebration that should have been one of the high points of her life. He was 55 or 56 years old. The cause was likely a malarial fever. Elizabeth kept his last letter to her, a brief note asking after her health, in a box beside her bed. The box was labelled in her own handwriting, his last letter. It was found there after her death 15 years later. 15 years. She kept it for 15 years. I want to offer you a thought that I think is worth sitting with. There is a version of Elizabeth's story, the version that focuses purely on the political genius, the strategic manoeuvring, the brilliant construction of the Virgin Queen mythology, in which Robert Dudley is essentially a chess piece. One she moved carefully, deployed strategically, and ultimately sacrificed to the larger game of her reign. I don't believe that version. Not entirely. I think Elizabeth Tudor loved Robert Dudley in whatever way a person shaped by her particular history was capable of loving, which is to say deeply and with considerable reservation, with awareness of the costs, with one hand always on the door because she had learned very early that the people you love are also the people who can destroy you, and that the only reliable protection is to never fully surrender the distance between yourself and anyone else. Was that a wound expressing itself as strategy? Absolutely. Was it also simply who she was shaped by everything we've traced from her mother's absence onward? I think so. The two things were not in conflict. They were the same thing. Which brings us finally to the 17 suitors. Because Robert Dudley was the most personal of them, the one who came closest, the one she actually wanted in some form. But he was far from the only one. And the parade of kings and princes and archdukes and noblemen who came to Elizabeth's court, each with their proposals and their ambitions and their fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with, that parade tells its own story. A story about power, about negotiation, about a woman who turned the most vulnerable aspect of her position, her unmarried status, the thing her council saw as a weakness, into one of the most effective diplomatic instruments of the 16th century. The names, the offers, the reasons they each failed, and what those failures reveal about Elizabeth's deeper intentions, that is exactly where we're headed next. All right, let's talk about the suitors, because if you've been following Elizabeth's story from the beginning, the lost mother, the dangerous adolescence, the tower, the Dudley affair, the brilliant political mythology she constructed around herself, you might be tempted to think that the parade of men who proposed to her was simply background noise. Political inconveniences she managed with a wave of her jewelled hand. They were not background noise. They were collectively one of the most extraordinary diplomatic juggling acts in the history of European monarchy. And the way Elizabeth handled each of them, the timing, the excuses, the warmth deployed at precisely calibrated moments, the doors left just barely open and then just barely closed, reveals a mind operating at a level that most of her contemporaries, brilliant as some of them were, simply could not match. So, let's go through them. Not all 17, we would be here until next week, but the most significant ones. The ones that tell the story. The first, and in some ways most consequential proposal came before Elizabeth had even been crowned. Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in the world at that moment, ruler of Spain, the Netherlands, much of Italy, and the rapidly expanding Spanish Empire in the Americas, proposed to Elizabeth within weeks of her accession in November of 1558. He had been married to her sister Mary. He had watched England slip away from the Catholic orbit when Mary died childless, and he calculated with the cold efficiency that characterized his entire reign that the fastest way to recover English cooperation was to marry its new queen. He sent his proposal through the Spanish ambassador. Elizabeth received it graciously. She expressed appropriate gratitude for the honour. She said she needed time to consider such an important matter. She indicated that her council would need to be consulted. She implied, without ever quite stating, that the answer might eventually be yes. It was never going to be yes. Philip himself seemed to understand this relatively quickly. He withdrew the proposal within a few months and began negotiating his marriage to Elizabeth of Valois, the French princess, which took place in 1559. But, and this is the crucial part, he remained diplomatically engaged with England. He remained for years a moderating influence on those in Catholic Europe who wanted to take more aggressive action against the Protestant English Queen. Because as long as there was the ghost of a possibility that Elizabeth might come around, might reconsider, might need Spanish support in some future crisis, Philip had reason to keep the relationship functional. Elizabeth had understood this from the very beginning. She had turned a rejected marriage proposal into a decade of useful diplomatic ambiguity. That is not luck. That is architecture. Then came the Swedish contingent, which is, I'll be honest, one of my favourite episodes in the entire Suter saga because it has an almost comedic quality to it that Elizabeth seemed to quietly enjoy. King Eric XIV of Sweden was persistent in a way that went well beyond diplomatic convention. He sent ambassadors, he sent gifts, he reportedly considered sailing to England himself to press his case in person, which his council managed to talk him out of, possibly, by pointing out that showing up uninvited to propose to the Queen of England was not considered good form. He wrote letters that were, by the standards of 16th-century royal correspondence, remarkably personal. He was genuinely, sincerely infatuated, or at least convinced himself that he was. Elizabeth was warm. Elizabeth was appreciative. Elizabeth expressed admiration for Sweden's king and the honour of his attention. Elizabeth never said yes. Eric eventually married Karin Mundsdotter, a soldier's daughter, in 1568, a marriage so far outside conventional royal expectation that it scandalized most of Europe and contributed to his eventual removal from the throne. Elizabeth, upon hearing of his troubles, is not recorded as having expressed particular surprise. Now the Habsburg candidates deserve more careful attention, because they were the most serious and the most protracted of all the negotiations, and because the way Elizabeth handled them reveals her strategic mind at its clearest. Archduke Ferdinand of Austria was proposed first in 1559. He was a serious candidate, Catholic, politically connected part of the most powerful dynasty in Europe. Elizabeth indicated interest. Negotiations began. They progressed at a pace that with hindsight you recognize as deliberately glacial. By the time the religious question became the central sticking point, would he attend Protestant services? Would she permit him a private Catholic chapel? Several years had passed, and the political landscape had shifted enough that the whole enterprise could be quietly shelved. Then his younger brother, Archduke Charles, stepped into the same negotiation and spent roughly 5 years in the same holding pattern. The historian Susan Doran, who's written some of the most careful scholarship on Elizabeth's marriage negotiations, has documented how these talks went through multiple rounds of apparent progress, followed by insurmountable obstacles that appeared with suspicious regularity at exactly the moments when commitment would have been required. I'm not saying Elizabeth invented the religious objection. It was a genuine issue. But I am saying that she deployed it with a timing and a precision that suggest it functioned as much as an exit strategy, as a sincere theological concern. There's a pattern in all of these negotiations that becomes visible once you know to look for it, and I want to name it clearly because I think it's important. Elizabeth never rejected a suitor with finality. until the political usefulness of the negotiation had been fully extracted. The Swedish connection kept the Baltic trade routes friendly. The Habsburg negotiations kept both the Spanish and the Austrian branches of the most powerful European dynasty from becoming openly hostile during the vulnerable early years of her reign. The French suitors, and there were French suitors, most notably the Duke of Anjou Henry of Valois in the 1570s, and then his younger brother Francis, Duke of Anjou, in the early 1580s, kept France engaged and complicated the Franco-Scottish alliance that threatened England from the north. Every proposal was a negotiation. Every negotiation produced something, and none of them produced a husband. The Francis of Anjou episode deserves particular attention because it was the last serious marriage negotiation of Elizabeth's life, and because it is the one that most complicates any simple reading of her motives. Francis, Duke of Anjou, was the younger brother of King Henry III of France. He was considerably younger than Elizabeth, born in 1555, making him about 20 years her junior, when the negotiations began seriously in the late 1570s. He was not handsome. Contemporary accounts describe him as short-scarred by smallpox with a notably large nose. He was also politically useful since he represented a potential counterweight to Spanish power in the Netherlands and a strengthening of the Anglo-French relationship. Elizabeth called him her frog. She wore a frog-shaped earring he gave her. She wrote him letters that were by her standards unusually warm and personal. When he visited England in 1579 and again in 1581, she was publicly affectionate with him in ways that alarmed her council, who were not certain whether to be relieved that she finally seemed genuinely interested or terrified of the same thing. In November of 1581, in front of witnesses at court, Elizabeth kissed Francis on the mouth and stated that he should have her hand. Her council was thunderstruck. The public response, when word spread, was largely negative. England had no appetite for a French Catholic consort. One pamphleteer, John Stubbs, published a protest so pointed that he was punished by having his right hand cut off, after which he reportedly lifted his hat with his remaining hand and called out, "God save the Queen," before fainting from blood loss. Elizabeth, when she heard about the punishment, was reportedly distressed. Whether the distress was about Stubbs or about the broader evidence that her people would not accept this marriage is unclear. What happened next is one of the most debated moments of her reign. That same night after the public hand-kiss, Elizabeth reportedly walked through her chambers in visible distress, reportedly telling her ladies that she had spent the night in more grief than she had suffered since the loss of her kingdom. Her words, or close to them. She did not marry Francis of Anjou. He left England in 1582 and died 2 years later of fever in the Netherlands. But something in that night's distress, whatever it was, reads differently to me than the calm, strategic manoeuvring of the Habsburg negotiations. It reads like someone who had reached an edge and looked over it and then stepped back. Whether what she stepped back from was genuine desire, political impossibility, or some irreducible mixture of both nobody alive can tell you with certainty. Here's the question I want to put to you directly because I think you've earned it by following this story all the way through. Do you think she wanted to marry any of them ever? It's worth thinking about because the answer actually changes depending on which chapter of her life you're looking at. The early Elizabeth 25, newly crowned, genuinely uncertain of how long she would survive, may have kept marriage genuinely open as a possibility. The middle Elizabeth, 40 years old, watching her counsel's hair go grey with anxiety about the succession, had probably made her decision and was managing appearances. The late Elizabeth kissing a French duke on the mouth and then weeping in her chambers that Elizabeth is the one I find hardest to read, and therefore the most interesting. What I can tell you is this: across 30 years of negotiations, 17 formal proposals from candidates ranging from the most powerful monarch in the world to the eager young King of Sweden, Elizabeth never came closer to the altar than that November night in 1581. And even then she stepped back, not because she was passive, not because she was confused, but because at every decisive moment the woman who had learned in the Tower of London what it meant to be powerless chose deliberately, consciously, at considerable personal cost to remain the one holding the decision. The succession crisis that this created, however, was not a small problem that could be quietly managed. It grew over the decades into something that threatened to tear England apart. Parliament petitioned her. Her council drafted proposals. Ordinary Englishmen worried aloud about what would happen when she died without an heir, and Elizabeth's response to that crisis, the way she talked about it, argued against it, deflected it, and ultimately refused to resolve it on anyone's terms but her own, is where we are going next. Because the succession question was not just about marriage anymore. It was about power itself, about who had the right to define what a queen owed her country. And Elizabeth had a very clear, very firm and very personal answer to that question. Of all the battles Elizabeth Tudor fought in her 45 years as queen, and there were many against foreign powers, against religious factions, against conspirators and assassins, and the slow erosion of time itself, the one that came closest to breaking her, was not fought on any battlefield. It was fought in the chamber of the House of Commons, in the formal petitions of her Privy Council, in the whispered conversations of courtiers who loved her and were terrified of what came next. It was fought again and again over a single question that grew more urgent with every passing year. Who comes after you? And Elizabeth's answer, or rather her extraordinary, maddening, historically unprecedented refusal to give an answer, is the chapter of her story that I think modern audiences most consistently underestimate, because it looks from the outside like stubbornness, like vanity, like a woman who simply could not bring herself to confront an uncomfortable reality. It was none of those things. Or rather, it was all of those things, and also something far more calculated, far more dangerous, and far more fascinating than any of them alone. Let's establish the stakes clearly, because they were genuinely enormous. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, England had just lived through 30 years of the most destabilizing succession politics in its history. Henry VIII had changed his heirs so many times that the legal framework governing royal succession had been rewritten multiple times within a single generation. Edward VI had died at 15, triggering a botched attempt to install Lady Jane Grey that lasted 9 days before collapsing. Mary I had died childless after a reign defined substantially by the grief of her failed pregnancies. England was exhausted by uncertainty. The concept of a clear, uncontested succession was not an abstract political nicety. It was the difference between stability and the kind of civil conflict that had torn France apart and would tear it apart again before the century was over. The Wars of the Roses fought over exactly this kind of dynastic ambiguity. Less than 100 years earlier were not ancient history to Elizabeth's subjects. They were living memory passed down through grandparents and great-uncles who had lived through them. So when Parliament petitioned Elizabeth in 1559, just months into her reign, asking her to marry and secure the succession, they were not being unreasonable. They were being, by the standards of their time and situation, entirely rational. Elizabeth knew this. She was not an unreasonable woman. And yet, her first major parliamentary confrontation on the succession question came in 1563 following a smallpox illness that had nearly killed her the previous year. This near-death experience had rattled the entire political establishment in a way that no amount of abstract argument about succession had managed to do. If Elizabeth had died in October of 1562, and she very nearly did, slipping into unconsciousness and being given up for lost before unexpectedly recovering England, would have had no designated heir. The resulting chaos was almost too large to contemplate. Parliament reconvened with a new urgency. Both the Lords and the Commons submitted petitions asking Elizabeth to name a successor if she would not agree to marry immediately. The petitions were careful, respectful, and absolutely firm. They laid out the dangers in plain language. They asked for a direct answer. Elizabeth's response to those petitions is one of the great documents of her reign, and I want to spend a moment with it, because it reveals something important about how her mind worked. She did not refuse, she also did not agree, though. What she did instead was deliver a speech that acknowledged the legitimacy of Parliament's concern, expressed genuine gratitude for their care for her, and for England explained with apparent sincerity why the decision was difficult and complex, and concluded with a promise to marry at some point when circumstances permitted, a promise that was structured so carefully that it committed her to absolutely nothing while appearing to commit her to something. Her council read it and groaned. Her biographers have been analysing it for 4 centuries. It was, depending on your perspective, either a masterpiece of political rhetoric or an exercise in breathtaking evasion. I think it was both, and I think Elizabeth would have been quietly pleased by that description. What makes the succession crisis so genuinely gripping, though, is not the parliamentary debates. It is the specific candidates who existed as potential heirs and the impossible political geometry that surrounded each of them. The most obvious candidate by blood and proximity was Mary, Queen of Scots. She was Elizabeth's first cousin, once removed a granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Margaret Tudor. She was also Catholic French educated, already a queen in her own right, and backed by France and intermittently by Spain. Naming Mary as her heir would have been for a significant portion of Protestant England equivalent to signing the country's death warrant as a Protestant nation. Elizabeth never named her. Not formally, not with any legal weight, despite decades of pressure. Then there were the Grey sisters, Lady Catherine Grey and Lady Mary Grey, descendants of Henry VIII's younger sister Mary Tudor. They were Protestant, which made them acceptable to the English reformers. They were also politically disasters. Catherine Grey secretly married Edward Seymour, the son of the Lord Protector from Elizabeth's adolescence, without royal permission in 1560, a significant breach of protocol that landed both of them in the Tower. Elizabeth was reportedly furious in a way that went beyond political inconvenience, and historians have speculated that the secret marriage touched something personal, a reminder perhaps of how quickly private choices became political weapons. Lady Mary Grey, the youngest and physically smallest of the sisters, compounded the family pattern by secretly marrying a man named Thomas Keyes in 1565. Thomas Keyes was the royal sergeant porter. He was by contemporary accounts enormously tall. The marriage was by any political calculation completely inexplicable. Elizabeth had them separated and placed under house arrest, and one suspects she found the whole situation as baffling as she did infuriating. The Grey sisters, in other words, were not viable political solutions. They were additional problems wearing the shape of solutions. And then there was the question of James, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, born in 1566, who would eventually become the answer that Elizabeth refused to officially acknowledge for 37 years. James Stuart, the future James I of England and 6th of Scotland, was Protestant. He was the great-great-grandson of Henry VII. He had a legitimate dynastic claim. His mother had been neutralised as a political threat by her own catastrophic decisions. The murder of her husband, Lord Darnley, her marriage to the suspected killer, her forced abdication, her flight to England where Elizabeth kept her under house arrest for 19 years before reluctantly signing her execution warrant in 1587. By the late 1580s, the political case for James as eventual successor was strong enough that everyone at court understood it implicitly, including Elizabeth herself. What she refused to do absolutely consistently until the very last weeks of her life was say it out loud. Why, this is the question that has genuinely puzzled historians, and I want to offer you my own reading of it. Elizabeth once said in a speech to Parliament in 1566 one of the most psychologically revealing things she ever said publicly, that she knew what it meant to be a named successor. She said it was no more than a tablet of the second person or a dead body. She was speaking from direct experience. She had been her brother Edward's successor, then removed, then reinstated. She had been Mary's successor, which had made her a target for every discontented faction in England. She understood in her bones what naming a successor actually did. It created a rival power centre. It gave every malcontent, every foreign agent, every ambitious faction a living, breathing alternative to rally around. It transformed the named heir from a future monarch into a present danger. And it diminished the reigning monarch from the sole source of legitimate authority into something less than that a placeholder for a future that had already been officially designated. She was not willing to do that to herself. Having spent her entire life fighting to be taken seriously as the actual ruler, the actual authority, the actual centre of power in England, she was not going to voluntarily create a legal framework that implied she was merely temporary. There is something in this that I find genuinely moving, not in a sentimental way, but in a structural way. The girl who'd been declared illegitimate before she was 3, who had been made a prisoner before she was 21, who had governed for decades under the constant implicit suggestion that a woman ruling alone was a problem requiring a permanent solution in the form of a husband. That woman was not going to name her replacement. She was going to hold the centre of the stage until she physically could not hold it anymore. Whether that was wisdom or stubbornness, strategic genius, or something closer to an old wound expressing itself as policy, I genuinely do not know. I suspect it was all of those things pressed together until they were indistinguishable from each other. The crisis reached its most acute point in the mid-1560s, and again in the early 1570s, when various plots centred on Mary Queen of Scots made the question of succession literally a matter of national security. The Ridolfi plot of 1571, an international conspiracy involving the Spanish ambassador, the Duke of Norfolk, and Mary herself, aimed at overthrowing Elizabeth and restoring Catholic rule, was the moment that Parliament came closest to forcing Elizabeth's hand. They wanted Mary executed. They wanted the succession settled. They wanted guarantees. Elizabeth gave them the Duke of Norfolk's head. He was executed in June of 1572 for his role in the conspiracy. Mary she kept alive at enormous political cost for another 15 years. The succession she refused to settle for another 3 decades. Her council despaired. William Cecil, her most trusted adviser, her Secretary of State, the man who served her with extraordinary loyalty for 40 years, even he reached moments of genuine anguish over the succession question. His private papers from this period show a man trying to plan for contingencies that his queen refused to acknowledge, trying to protect a country whose ruler would not discuss what happened when she was no longer there to rule it. She knew she was making their lives difficult. She did it anyway. There is a quality to all of this that I think deserves to be named plainly courage. Not the comfortable kind of courage, not the kind that looks heroic in retrospect. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that requires you to hold a position that everyone around you, people who love you, people who are right about the dangers, is telling you to abandon. Elizabeth held that position for 45 years. England survived her. The succession passed in the end to James of Scotland exactly as everyone had privately understood it would. The transition when it finally came in March of 1603 was remarkably smooth, in part because the political groundwork had been laid informally over years, precisely because Elizabeth had refused to formalise it and force everyone to take sides prematurely. You could argue that her refusal to name a successor was one of the things that made the eventual succession peaceful. Or you could argue it was a catastrophic gamble that happened to pay off. Probably it was both. Elizabeth was good at both. But here is what none of the succession debates, none of the parliamentary petitions, none of the council meetings ever quite managed to articulate the thing that sat underneath all of it, unspoken, uncomfortable, and true. The succession crisis was not really about Elizabeth's mortality. It was about her identity. About whether the woman who had clawed her way from declared illegitimacy to the throne of England was going to spend her reign being defined by what she hadn't done rather than what she had. She had chosen against every expectation and every pressure to govern alone. To be the authority, not the consort of an authority. That choice had costs, real costs, political costs, personal costs. We've traced all the way back to a 4-year-old girl in a house where a certain name was no longer spoken, and she was not going to have those costs nullified by becoming a footnote in someone else's succession story. She was the story. That was the point. That had always been the point. Which brings us finally to the most brilliant move of her entire reign, the moment when she took everything we've just described, every pressure and expectation and demand, and transformed it into something that no one had quite seen before and no one has quite replicated since. The speech, the declaration, the moment she told England and Europe and history exactly who she was and who she had chosen to be. That is where we are going next. Words matter. They always have. But there are certain moments in history when a single sentence delivered in the right room at the right time by the right person does something that armies and treaties and decades of careful diplomacy cannot do. It reframes reality. It shifts the ground beneath everyone's feet. It takes a situation that looked one way and makes it permanently, irrevocably look another way instead. Elizabeth Tudor had several such moments across her long reign, but the one I keep coming back to, the one that I think deserves far more attention than it typically receives outside of academic circles, is not the Armada speech at Tilbury, magnificent as that was. It is quieter than that, less dramatic in its setting. But in terms of sheer rhetorical architecture, in terms of what it accomplished and how it accomplished it, it may be the single most effective piece of political communication she ever produced. It happened in 1559, just months into her reign, when Parliament pressed her for the first time about marriage and succession. And Elizabeth stood before them and said in carefully chosen words that she had almost certainly been composing in her mind for some time that she was already bound unto a husband, and she held up her coronation ring as she said it, which was the Kingdom of England. The room went quiet. Now let's be precise about what she actually did in that moment, because I think the full genius of it gets lost when we treat it as simply a pretty speech. Elizabeth was 25 years old. She had been queen for less than a year. She was surrounded by men, her council, her parliament, her foreign ambassadors who were operating from a shared assumption so fundamental they barely needed to state it, that a queen regnant was an incomplete governmental arrangement, a temporary state of affairs, a problem awaiting its solution in the form of a husband who would provide the real authority, the real continuity, the real legitimacy that a woman alone could not be expected to furnish. That assumption was not malicious for the most part. It was simply the water everyone swam in. The 16th century understanding of governance, of gender, of the natural order of political authority, all of it pointed in the same direction. A queen needed a king beside her. This was not debated. It was assumed. And Elizabeth, with one sentence and one lifted hand displaying one ring, reframed the entire conversation. She did not argue against the assumption directly. She did not say that women were capable of ruling alone, or that marriage was unnecessary, or that Parliament had no right to pressure her. She said something far more elegant and far more unanswerable than any of those things. She said she was already married, already committed, already bound by vows as serious and sacred as any marriage ceremony could produce, to England itself. Think about what this accomplished, and think about it from multiple angles simultaneously, because it worked on several levels at once. On the theological level, which mattered enormously in a 16th century context, it drew on the deep tradition of sacred kingship, the idea that monarchs were chosen by God, set apart, consecrated to a purpose higher than personal interest. Elizabeth was reframing her unmarried status not as a deficiency, but as a vocation, not as something missing, but as something present. She was not a woman without a husband. She was a queen with a calling. On the political level, it answered the pressure without yielding to it. She had given Parliament something, a response, an image, a framing they could work with publicly. What she had not given them was any actual commitment to change her behaviour. The marriage to England was a metaphor, not a legal arrangement. It bound her to nothing she had not already chosen, but it sounded like a binding. It performed commitment without constituting it. On the personal level, and this is the dimension I find most interesting, I think it was also true. Not literally, obviously, but emotionally, psychologically, in whatever way Elizabeth organised her interior life. England was by that point in her story the most stable and consuming relationship she had. It had claimed her completely. It asked everything of her, and gave her in return the one thing she had spent her entire life without a reliable supply of a reason to be exactly who she was, in exactly the place she was without apology. She was good at being queen. She knew it. And I think there was something in that specific competence, in the experience of being genuinely, demonstrably excellent, at something enormously difficult, that gave her a satisfaction and a security that no marriage proposal, however politically advantageous, could have matched. But the Married to England declaration was not a single speech and done. It was the beginning of a decades-long performance that Elizabeth refined and expanded and deepened over time until it had become something genuinely unprecedented in the history of European monarchy. She built an entire visual and ceremonial language around it. When she went on her royal progresses, the annual summer tours through the English countryside that were one of her most powerful tools of political connection, she presented herself to crowds not as a distant sovereign, but as something closer to a beloved partner. She spoke to ordinary people with a directness and apparent warmth that was by the standards of contemporary monarchy remarkable. She accepted gifts from small children in village squares with what seemed like genuine delight. She made speeches that addressed her subjects as my people, with a possessive intimacy that implied mutual belonging rather than mere ownership. In 1588 at Tilbury, on the eve of the expected Spanish landing, the speech that most people know or think they know, she said something that crystallized the entire Married to England framework perfectly. She told the assembled troops that she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. She said she herself would take up arms. Now, setting aside the historical debate about whether she actually delivered those exact words, or whether the surviving text represents a later version, the sentiment was consistent with everything she had been building for 30 years. The message was, I am yours completely. My body, my life, my authority, all of it is pledged to this country and this people. I have no husband to compete with that pledge. I have no private loyalty that supersedes it. That message resonated with the English public in a way that no amount of diplomatic marriage could have manufactured. because it was within the terms of the performance absolutely consistent. She had never contradicted it. She'd never produced a husband who undermined it. She had year after year, in hundreds of public appearances and thousands of letters and dozens of parliamentary speeches, delivered the same fundamental claim: England is my marriage, and I have been faithful to it. I want to compare this briefly to her sister Mary's experience, because the contrast illuminates exactly why Elizabeth's approach was as effective as it was. Mary I had married Philip II of Spain in 1554. From a dynastic standpoint, it was a defensible match. Philip was powerful Catholic, a potential military ally. From every other standpoint, it was a disaster for Mary's public standing. England did not want a Spanish king. The marriage sparked Wyatt's rebellion. Philip spent relatively little time in England, showing up primarily when he needed English support for his continental wars. He was widely disliked. And when Mary died in 1558, Philip's primary emotion appears to have been calculation about how quickly he could propose to the new queen. Mary had given England a husband and lost England's heart in the process. Elizabeth gave England herself and held England's heart for 45 years. The symmetry is not accidental. Elizabeth had watched what happened to Mary. She had drawn conclusions. There is a specific mechanism in the married to England construct that I want to name because I think it is one of the most psychologically sophisticated things Elizabeth ever did, and it rarely gets the credit it deserves. By framing herself as married to England, Elizabeth made her subjects participants in that marriage, not subjects of a queen, not tenants of a crown, partners. The language of the marriage metaphor implied mutual obligation, she to them to her. When she spoke of my people, with that particular warmth, she was not speaking down. She was speaking across the way you speak to someone you have made promises to. This created a form of political loyalty that was qualitatively different from the loyalty produced by fear or by legal obligation, or even by religious duty. It was personal, it was emotional, it was the kind of loyalty that made ordinary people feel irrationally but powerfully that Elizabeth's survival was their personal business. The Bond of Association of 1584, a document signed by thousands of English subjects pledging to defend Elizabeth's life and to revenge any harm done to her, was a remarkable expression of exactly this dynamic. People were not signing because they were required to. They were signing because they felt something, because the Married to England performance had over 25 years created a relationship between monarch and people that felt genuine enough to inspire genuine commitment. Whether it was genuine on Elizabeth's side is the question we keep circling back to, and I keep arriving at the same answer, probably yes, in the way that Elizabeth was capable of genuine things, which is to say deeply, and without ever quite losing the awareness that it was also serving a function. The two were not separate for her. They never were. Here's something worth pausing on because I find it genuinely striking every time I return to it. The Married to England declaration was made by a 25-year-old woman who had never governed anything before, to a room full of experienced men who had spent their careers in the corridors of power and who were for the most part sceptical that she would last. She made it in the first year of a reign that she had no guarantee would survive the decade, let alone extend to 45 years. And it lasted. The whole performance lasted. Not because Elizabeth was lucky, though she was sometimes lucky, but because she committed to the premise completely and never broke character. Not when Dudley married someone else. Not when the Francis of Anjou negotiations came close to producing an actual wedding. Not when she was old and ill, and the performance must have cost her more than it ever had before. She was in that specific sense the most faithful queen England ever had. faithful to the role she had chosen, to the identity she had constructed, to the promise she had made in that room in 1559, with a ring on her finger and a parliament full of doubting men watching her. That is not nothing. That is, depending on how you choose to measure these things, everything. And yet, and this is where I want to leave you poised on the edge of the next chapter, the brilliance of the performance does not fully answer the deeper question, the human question, the question of what was happening inside the woman who was delivering it. Because we have traced Elizabeth's story from a grief-shaped childhood, through a dangerous adolescence, through the Tower, and through Dudley, and through 17 suitors, and through decades of parliamentary pressure, and at every turn we have found the same convergence, the wound and the strategy occupying exactly the same space, indistinguishable from each other. What did the scholars and psychologists and historians who have spent their careers studying her actually conclude about that convergence, about what was driving Elizabeth at the deepest level, beneath the rhetoric, beneath the politics, beneath the extraordinary performance of the Virgin Queen? That question has generated some of the most interesting, most contentious, and most genuinely illuminating scholarship in the entire field of Tudor history, and we're going to go there now into the academic debates, the psychological theories, the competing frameworks that historians have built to explain a woman who spent 45 years making sure she could not be fully explained. The answers are more surprising and more human than you might expect. Scholars are a funny breed. Give them 4 centuries of distance from a subject, mountains of primary sources, the full apparatus of modern academic methodology, and they will still disagree. Passionately, in footnotes that sometimes read like barely restrained arguments at a dinner party. Elizabeth Tudor has attracted more scholarly disagreement per square inch of historical record than almost any other figure in English history. And the specific question of why she never married, the question that has been the spine of everything we've explored together, has generated theories that range from the coldly rational to the deeply psychological to the genuinely controversial. Some of these theories contradict each other. Some of them I think are simultaneously true, which is the kind of thing that drives people who like clean answers slightly mad. So let's go through them honestly. Let's look at what the serious scholarship actually says, and then let's do what I always think is the most interesting thing you can do with historical evidence. Let's think about what it means for a real human being, not just a historical figure. The first major school of thought is what we might call the rational calculation framework. Its most prominent modern advocates include historians like David Loades and Penry Williams, and the argument runs something like this: Elizabeth never married because she performed a clear-eyed cost-benefit analysis and concluded that the costs consistently outweighed the benefits. The evidence for this position is substantial. We have already traced much of it across previous chapters, the way she extracted diplomatic value from marriage negotiations, without ever concluding them, the way each rejection was timed to maximize political utility, the way she seemed to understand instinctively that her unmarried status was a negotiating asset that would evaporate the moment she chose a husband. But the rational calculation framework has a weakness, and the best historians who work within it acknowledge it. It explains the pattern of behaviour perfectly well. It does not explain the Francis of Anjou night. It does not explain the box beside her bed with Robert Dudley's last letter inside it, labelled in her own handwriting, kept for 15 years. Pure rational calculation does not produce that kind of artifact. So we need to go deeper. The second major framework is what I would call the structural power argument, and it has been developed most compellingly by scholars like Anne Somerset and Carol Levin. This argument focuses not on Elizabeth's psychology, but on the objective structural reality of what marriage would have meant for a queen regnant in the 16th century. The argument is simple. and devastating marriage for any woman of that era meant legal subordination. For a reigning queen, it meant something even more specific and alarming. It meant that the sovereign authority she held would in practice, if not always in law, begin migrating toward her husband. The precedent from Mary's marriage to Philip was fresh and vivid. The legal frameworks governing married women's property and authority were clear, even if royal marriages existed in a somewhat ambiguous zone. Elizabeth would have understood this not as an abstract political theory, but as a lived reality. She had watched it happen. She'd been a political player in the court where it happened. She had seen how quickly the language of English governance began incorporating Philip's preferences and Philip's priorities once Mary was married to him. The structural power argument says essentially, of course, she didn't marry. Given what marriage would have cost her in terms of actual governing authority, only a woman with no interest in governing would have accepted it willingly. And Elizabeth was nothing if not interested in governing. I find this argument genuinely compelling, but I also think it has the same limitation as the rational calculation framework. It explains the decision without fully explaining the person, and Elizabeth was before she was a decisioner person, which brings us to the psychological frameworks, and here is where things get genuinely interesting and genuinely contentious. The scholar who pushed hardest and most specifically into the psychological dimensions of Elizabeth's choice was the American historian Carolee Erickson, whose biography from the 1980s was one of the first major works to engage seriously with the question of how Elizabeth's childhood experiences shaped her adult behavior. Erickson argued that the losses and disruptions of Elizabeth's early years, the mother's execution, the dangerous adolescence, the series of powerful figures who had failed to protect her, had produced an adult who was constitutionally unable to trust the kind of intimacy that marriage required. This framing draws on what psychologists today would recognize as attachment theory, the body of research developed primarily by John Bowlby in the mid-20th century, which describes how early experiences of loss, inconsistency, or danger in close relationships create lasting patterns in how people approach intimacy as adults. People who experience early attachment disruption often develop what psychologists call avoidant attachment styles. They value connection, but retreat from the vulnerability that genuine closeness requires. They are capable of warmth, even of love, but they maintain a careful distance from the point of no return. Now, I want to be appropriately cautious here because applying modern psychological frameworks to historical figures is a methodologically tricky business. Elizabeth cannot be interviewed. She cannot complete a questionnaire. The evidence we have is filtered through the biases and limitations of 16th century documentation, written largely by men, largely for political purposes, largely without any interest in the kind of interior emotional life that modern psychology cares about. And this is the part that I think honest scholarship has to acknowledge. The behavioral pattern is consistent enough across enough years and enough different contexts that something structural was clearly operating. The careful management of intimacy, the warmth deployed at calibrated distance, the way she could be extraordinarily close to someone as she was with Dudley, as she was in different ways with certain trusted counselors, while never quite surrendering the final degree of control that total intimacy would have required. That is a recognizable pattern. It has a recognizable shape. And while we cannot diagnose Elizabeth from 4 centuries away, we can observe that the shape of her behavior fits very neatly into a framework that psychology has developed to describe people whose early experiences taught them that closeness and danger are closely associated. Then there is a third category of scholarship, smaller, more controversial but impossible to ignore, that focuses on a specific historical claim about Elizabeth's physical experience. Some historians, including the scholar Peggy Munoz Siemens, working within a broader tradition that goes back to Elizabeth's own contemporaries, have suggested that the Thomas Seymour experience was more damaging in specific ways than the official historical record, which focuses on the boundary violations we discussed in an earlier chapter, fully captures. These scholars point to the intensity of Elizabeth's reaction to the episode, the thoroughness with which she afterwards controlled access to her person, and certain suggestive but ambiguous documentary fragments as evidence that something more serious may have occurred. I want to be careful and honest here, this remains disputed. The mainstream historical consensus does not go that far. What the mainstream consensus does accept is that the Seymour episode was genuinely traumatic, that it involved a serious breach of trust and safety by a powerful adult, and that it demonstrably shaped Elizabeth's subsequent behaviour toward men and toward physical intimacy. The precise degree of that shaping is where scholars disagree, and without more evidence than we currently have, certainty is not available. What I can say is this: something happened in that Chelsea household that left marks. The marks are visible in the documentary record. Their exact depth and character are debated, and they belong to a larger pattern of experience that, taken together, would challenge the capacity for uncomplicated intimacy in virtually any person. There is a fourth framework that I want to spend a moment with because I think it is underrepresented in the popular understanding of Elizabeth, and because it strikes me as genuinely insightful. Several historians, most notably Susan Doran, whose work on Elizabeth's marriage negotiations is the most meticulously researched available, have argued for what might be called the deliberate ambiguity theory. This framework suggests that Elizabeth's relationship to marriage was neither a settled psychological aversion nor a purely rational calculation, but something more dynamic, a genuine ongoing uncertainty that she chose consciously and strategically never to resolve. The argument goes something like this. At various points in her reign, Elizabeth may have genuinely been open to marriage, more open than the clean narrative of the Virgin Queen suggests. The negotiations with Archduke Charles the Anjou episode, even certain moments with Dudley, these may not all have been performances. Some of them may have been genuine deliberations that she ultimately stepped back from each time, for reasons that were specific to that moment rather than reflecting a fixed internal position. What she then did, according to this reading, was take that genuine uncertainty and transform it into a political instrument. The ambiguity was real, so she performed it as ambiguity, which kept everyone in the useful position of not quite knowing what she would ultimately choose. I find this framework the most psychologically sophisticated of the four, because it makes room for Elizabeth to be a person with genuine internal contradictions, someone who was at different times and in different ways both genuinely uncertain and genuinely strategic. Not a saint and not a cynic. A human being navigating an extraordinary situation with the tools available to her, shaped by everything she'd experienced, capable of both feeling and calculating, sometimes in the same breath. Here is where I land after spending a long time with all of these frameworks. And I offer this not as the definitive answer, because there is no definitive answer, but as my honest reading of the evidence. Elizabeth Tudor did not marry for reasons that were simultaneously psychological, structural, political, and personal, and those reasons were not in conflict with each other. They reinforced each other. They grew from the same soil. The childhood losses and dangers taught her that dependency was dangerous. The structural reality of 16th century marriage confirmed what her personal experience had suggested, that to marry was to risk losing what she had spent her entire life fighting to hold. The political genius she developed allowed her to transform that personal and structural reality into an asset rather than a liability. And the specific quality of her intelligence, the ability to inhabit contradictions without being destroyed by them, allowed her to sustain the performance indefinitely without it feeling to her or to those around her entirely like a performance. She was in the end a woman who had learned very early that the world did not automatically make room for her, that she had to make the room herself with whatever tools she had, and she did, brilliantly, at considerable personal cost, with enough self-awareness to know the cost and enough strength to pay it anyway. Does that sound like someone you know? Not necessarily a queen, not necessarily someone from the 16th century, but someone who learned early that safety had to be earned, that trust had to be rationed, that the space to be yourself fully required constant maintenance and vigilance. I think that is why Elizabeth still resonates. Not because she was so different from us, but because underneath the jewels and the rhetoric and the extraordinary historical circumstances, the fundamental shape of her experience is one that a surprising number of people recognize. What the scholars ultimately cannot settle, what no amount of primary source analysis or psychological framework can fully resolve, is the question of regret. Whether Elizabeth, in her quieter moments in the years when the performance was most demanding and the personal costs most visible, looked at what she had chosen and felt the weight of it, we have small evidence. The box with Dudley's letter, the early portrait viewed in silence in the 1590s, certain moments reported by ladies in waiting that suggest a woman aware of paths not taken, but regret even if she felt it was not the same as error. And I think Elizabeth knew the difference. Which brings us finally to the question of what her choice meant beyond her own life, beyond her own experience, beyond the specific circumstances of Tudor England in the 16th century. Because the legacy of the Virgin Queen, what her 45 years of unmarried rule actually produced, what it changed, what it made possible, turns out to be far larger and far more consequential than even Elizabeth herself may have understood. That is the final chapter, and it begins right now. There is something we have not yet examined closely enough, something that sits in plain sight throughout Elizabeth's childhood and early adolescence, so obvious that it is almost easy to overlook the way you sometimes overlook the furniture in a room you know too well. Henry VIII had 6 wives. Elizabeth had, depending on how you count the timing of her own mother's presence, 5 stepmothers, and while we have spoken about Anne Boleyn's absence and its psychological weight, and while we touched on Catherine Parr's household in the context of Thomas Seymour, we have not yet done justice to what those 5 women, as a collective, as a pattern, as a lived education in what marriage actually produced, taught the young Elizabeth about the institution of matrimony itself. Because here is the thing that strikes me every time I think about Elizabeth's childhood. From this particular angle, she did not just lose her mother to the machinery of a royal marriage. She watched with the developing comprehension of a growing child, and then a sharp-minded adolescent as that same machinery processed 5 additional women. 5 different personalities, 5 different strategies for navigating the position of Henry's wife, 5 different outcomes, and not one of those outcomes, not a single one, looked like something to envy. Let's go through them in order because the sequence matters. Jane Seymour came first in Elizabeth's direct experience arriving as queen immediately after Anne Boleyn's execution in May of 1536. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old, too young for conscious memory of Jane herself, but not too young to absorb the atmosphere of a court that had just undergone a violent upheaval and was now recalibrating itself around a new woman in the central position. Jane gave Henry what he'd wanted most, a male heir. Edward was born in October of 1537, and England celebrated. Jane died 12 days later from complications of childbirth, puerperal fever, most likely the bacterial infection that killed so many women in an era before the relationship between cleanliness and infection was understood. She was 28 or 29 years old. She'd been queen for 17 months. She'd done everything right by the standards of her time. She had been modest. She had been Catholic, she had been fertile, she had produced the male heir that 2 previous wives had failed to provide. And she had died anyway, her body having paid the price that the duty of a royal wife required. Elizabeth was 4 years old when Jane Seymour died, too young to consciously process the lesson, but the lesson was there embedded in the structure of events around her. The woman who fulfilled her role most completely, the woman who gave the king what he wanted, most died in the fulfillment of that duty. Then came Anne of Cleves, and if the story of Henry's wives were a stage production, Anne of Cleves would be the darkly comedic interlude, the moment of near farce that makes the surrounding tragedy more bearable by comparison. Henry had agreed to the match largely on the basis of a portrait by Hans Holbein, which depicted Anne favourably. When she arrived in England in December of 1539, and Henry met her for the first time, he was, to put it diplomatically, disappointed. He reportedly found her unattractive, described her privately in terms that his courtiers found alarming in their vividness, and almost immediately began looking for a way out of the marriage. Anne of Cleves became queen in January of 1540. She was declared queen no more in July of the same year the marriage annulled on the grounds that it had never been consummated. She received a generous financial settlement, several properties, the honorary title of the king's sister, and effectively a very comfortable retirement from the most dangerous job in England. Elizabeth was 6 years old during all of this, old enough perhaps to register the bewildering speed with which a woman could go from queen to not queen, old enough to notice the way the adults around her recalibrated their behaviour and their language in response to these shifts, old enough to begin, however dimly, to understand that the position of the woman beside the king was not a fixed point. It was a conditional arrangement subject to revision without notice. Anne of Cleves incidentally survived Henry by 10 years, outliving him and all of his other wives. She's often described as the luckiest of the 6. Make of that what you will. Catherine Howard is where the childhood education in marriage became for Elizabeth something considerably darker. Catherine was young, probably 15 or 16, when she married Henry in July of 1540, just 3 weeks after the Cleves marriage was annulled. Henry was 48. Catherine was the niece of Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and had been deliberately positioned as a match by the Howard family, as part of their ongoing struggle for influence at court. She was by every account vivacious, charming, and catastrophically unprepared for the position she'd been placed in. She had a personal history relationships before her marriage to Henry, including what appears to have been a genuinely coercive situation in the household where she was raised as a young girl, that her enemies were eventually able to use against her. She was also conducting what appears to have been a genuine relationship with a young man named Thomas Culpeper after her marriage to Henry, which was in the legal and political framework of the time treasonous. She was arrested in November of 1541. She was executed in February of 1542. She was probably 17 years old. Elizabeth was 8 when Catherine Howard was arrested. 8 when the court convulsed with another round of accusations, trials, and the particular kind of political violence that the Tudor court had developed into something almost procedural. 8 when another woman who had occupied the position of queen was taken to the Tower and did not come back out. There is a story, possibly true, possibly elaborated over time in the retelling, that Catherine Howard ran screaming through the gallery at Hampton Court trying to reach the king to plead her case, and that the guards caught her and dragged her away. The gallery is still there. Visitors to Hampton Court have reported for centuries that they sometimes hear screaming in that corridor. This is almost certainly not supernatural, but it is a testament to how completely that image, a young woman desperately, uselessly reaching for the man who held power over her life, embedded itself in the cultural memory of the place. Elizabeth, at 8 years old, was somewhere in that world, processing as children do in ways they cannot fully articulate, Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife, is the one who provided Elizabeth with a different kind of education, and in some ways the most complicated one of all. Catherine Parr was learned thoughtful Protestant in her sympathies and genuinely invested in Elizabeth's intellectual development. She was the stabilizing presence in Elizabeth's adolescence that we've mentioned. She was also, by the time Henry died in January of 1547, a woman who had survived marriage to the most dangerous husband in England through a combination of intelligence, careful behaviour, and what must have been extraordinary reserves of self-control. Henry, near the end of his life, had become suspicious of Catherine's Protestant leanings and had reportedly authorised an investigation into whether she might be charged with heresy, which carried its own lethal possibilities. Catherine had managed to diffuse this situation through a direct conversation with Henry, in which she effectively argued that she had merely been trying to stimulate debate to distract him from the pain of his physical ailments. Whether this was true or whether it was the most impressive piece of crisis management in a reign full of impressive crisis management, nobody quite knows. But it worked. She survived. Then Henry died, and Catherine did the thing that Elizabeth would have been watching very carefully. She married Thomas Seymour quickly and secretly, less than 6 months after Henry's death. She had loved Seymour apparently before Henry had chosen her, and now she could finally make that choice freely. And then Catherine Parr died in childbirth in September of 1548, less than 2 years after Henry, a few months after a difficult pregnancy, during which she'd been aware that her husband was behaving in disturbing ways toward the teenage Elizabeth in her household. Think about what Elizabeth had just watched. Catherine Parr, the smartest of the stepmothers, the one who had navigated Henry's court most skillfully, the one who had survived when others had not, had made her own free choice about marriage the moment she could, had chosen the man she loved, and had died at 36 in childbirth, leaving a daughter who had not survived infancy in a household whose master had already compromised his trustworthiness beyond repair. Elizabeth was 14 when Catherine Parr died. She was not a child anymore. She understood what she had just witnessed. Now step back and look at the complete picture. 5 women, 5 different personalities, 5 different strategies, 5 different circumstances, and the outcomes laid out plainly. Anne Boleyn executed. Jane Seymour died in childbirth after fulfilling her duty perfectly. Anne of Cleves discarded after 6 months, fortunate enough to escape with her life and her financial settlement. Catherine Howard executed probably 17 years old. Catherine Parr survived Henry through extraordinary skill and considerable luck, then chose freely and died in childbirth anyway. Not one of those women had ended up by any reasonable measure in a position better than the one she'd been in before becoming Henry's wife. The most successful outcome in the entire group, Anne of Cleves quietly living on her English estates, financially comfortable and politically irrelevant, was essentially the outcome of having been rejected. Elizabeth had absorbed this education over 14 years of direct proximity. She had not read about it in history books. She had lived inside it. She had watched these women move through the machinery of royal marriage at close range with the growing comprehension of someone who was herself a woman in the same world, subject to the same forces, vulnerable to the same outcomes. Here is the question I want to put to you, and I genuinely want you to think about it, rather than just absorb it. If you had grown up watching 5 different people attempt the same thing 5 times, with 5 different approaches, and not one of them had produced an outcome you would willingly choose for yourself, what would your relationship to that thing be? Would you think of it as a natural aspiration, or would you think of it as a risk that required extraordinary justification before you would accept it? This is the question that the stepmothers asked collectively, across the arc of Elizabeth's childhood. And the answer, Elizabeth's answer, was written across the next 60 years of her life. She was not simply afraid of marriage in an irrational, traumatized way. She was operating from a data set, a deeply personal, deeply specific data set that had been assembled in the most vivid possible way through direct observation of real people she had actually known across the most formative years of her development. The data said, "Be very careful." The data said the women who trusted this institution most fully paid the highest prices. The data said the one who escaped with the most was the one who was rejected before it could fully claim her. I want to offer one more observation before we move to our final chapter, because I think it connects the stepmothers to the larger story in a way that is worth making explicit. Elizabeth's famous control, the emotional management, the careful calibration of closeness, the way she could be warm and yet unreachable at the same time is often described as a political skill. And it was. But I think it was also at a deeper level something she had learned by watching 5 women who had not maintained that control, or who had not been permitted to maintain it, or who had maintained it brilliantly and been undone anyway. She had seen what happened when you gave the king everything he asked for. She had seen what happened when you didn't. She had seen what happened when you were smart and careful, and positioned yourself perfectly. She had seen what happened when you were young and underprepared, and placed in a situation that required capabilities nobody had thought to develop in you. None of it had ended well, so she built the control into the architecture of her life. Not as a barrier to experience, but as the condition under which experience was possible. She could be Elizabeth, curious, passionate, brilliant, genuinely connected to the people around her, only within a structure that kept the final authority over her own existence firmly in her own hands. The stepmothers taught her that. All 5 of them in their different ways through their different fates over 14 years of proximity. It was not the education anyone had planned for her, but it was the one she got, and she used it. Which brings us finally to where this entire story has been heading from the very beginning, to the question of legacy, to what Elizabeth's choice built from all of this, shaped by all of this, sustained through 45 years of a reign that transformed England and left permanent marks on history actually meant, what it changed, what it opened up, what it made possible for the women who came after her, and what it continues to mean in a world that is still in ways both obvious and subtle, working through the questions she raised by the way she lived. That is the final chapter, and I promise you, it is worth waiting for. March the 24th, 1603, Richmond Palace just outside London. In a room that smelled of candle smoke and old stone, Elizabeth Tudor died in the early hours of the morning. She was 69 years old, an extraordinary age for anyone in that era, and remarkable for a woman who had spent decades under the kind of sustained physical and psychological pressure that her position demanded. She'd been declining for weeks, refusing to eat, refusing to go to bed, sitting on cushions on the floor of her chamber, in a kind of silent vigil that her courtiers found deeply unsettling and did not know how to interpret. She had not named her successor formally, not even at the end. There is a story disputed, as so many of the best Elizabeth stories are, that when her council gathered around her and asked her to give some sign, some gesture toward James of Scotland, she raised her hand and formed her fingers into a shape that could be interpreted as a crown, a gesture, not a declaration, ambiguous to the last. She died as she had lived on her own terms, or as close to her own terms as the final indignity of physical decline permitted, and within hours the horsemen were riding north to Edinburgh to tell James Stuart that he was King of England. The immediate response to Elizabeth's death was by the accounts of people present in London that spring something more complicated than simple grief. There was grief, genuine, widespread among people who'd known no other monarch for 45 years, who had grown up and grown old entirely within the Elizabethan world. but there was also underneath it something that might be described as a collective exhale. The succession question, which had haunted England for 4 decades, was resolved. The crisis that had always been coming had arrived and was already resolving itself peacefully, without the civil conflict that everyone had feared. That peaceful transition was not accidental, and it was not despite what you might expect from everything we know about Elizabeth's refusal to formally designate her successor. Despite all of that, it was not entirely despite her, because Elizabeth, in refusing to name James officially, had also refused to name anyone else. She had held the field clear. She had prevented any premature consolidation of faction around a designated heir that might have produced conflict during her lifetime, and she had, in her infuriating, brilliant, characteristically indirect way, allowed the political reality of James's succession to establish itself so thoroughly in the minds of everyone who mattered that when the moment came, there was nothing left to fight about. That was either extraordinary statesmanship or extraordinary luck wearing the disguise of statesmanship. Knowing Elizabeth I leaned toward the former, but I want to move past the immediate circumstances of her death, because the legacy I am most interested in, the one I think matters most for us sitting here 4.5 centuries later, is not about the specific mechanics of the Jacobean succession. It is about something larger, something that Elizabeth's reign introduced into the world that had not quite existed in that form before. She demonstrated across 45 years of documented, scrutinized, analyzed governance that a woman could hold sovereign power, not as a regent for a husband or a son, not as a temporary arrangement pending the restoration of proper male authority, but as the thing itself, as the permanent, actual, legitimate centre of a functioning state. This sounds simple. It was not simple. It was in the context of 16th century European political thought genuinely radical, even though Elizabeth herself would have recoiled from that word. She was not a revolutionary. She did not think of herself as making arguments about women's capacity for leadership. She thought of herself as a monarch doing her job, but the doing of the job across 4.5 decades in full view of Europe created evidence that could not be argued away. Let me give you a specific example of what I mean, because abstract arguments about legacy can drift into vagueness, and Elizabeth deserves better than vagueness. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, the dominant intellectual framework for thinking about women and political authority in Protestant Europe had been established in substantial part by a Scottish reformer named John Knox. In 1558, the same year Elizabeth was crowned, which tells you something about the timing. Knox published a pamphlet called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. The title alone gives you the temperature of the argument. Knox's central claim was that female rule was contrary to nature, contrary to God's order, and an offence against the proper arrangement of human society. Knox was not a fringe figure. He was one of the most influential Protestant thinkers of the age. His argument reflected a widespread assumption, not universal but dominant in the intellectual culture of his time. Elizabeth characteristically responded to Knox's pamphlet not by engaging with it directly, but by governing so effectively for so long that the argument began to look year by year, decade by decade, increasingly absurd. She did not write rebuttals. She built a navy. She navigated the religious settlement of England through waters that had destroyed her predecessors. She managed the most sophisticated diplomatic operation in Europe from a position of structural disadvantage and made it look from the outside like mastery. By the time she died in 1603, Knox's argument had not been formally defeated, but it had been practically undermined in a way that theoretical rebuttals never could have managed. Because theory is easy to dismiss, 45 years of demonstrable governance is considerably harder, The specific policy achievements of her reign deserve at least a moment of direct attention, because they are sometimes overshadowed by the personality and the mythology, and that is a disservice to what she actually built. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 created a Church of England that was Protestant in theology, but sufficiently moderate in practice to hold together a country that had been violently divided by religious conflict for 30 years. It was not perfect, nothing in religious history ever is, but it was durable. It held. In an era when religious conflict was tearing France and the Low Countries and Germany apart with devastating violence, England found something like workable stability. That settlement was Elizabeth's work, shaped by her own instincts toward moderation and her resistance to both Catholic restoration and extreme Protestant reform. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is the military moment everyone knows. But what is less often appreciated is the diplomatic preparation that preceded it, the years of careful manoeuvring that kept Spain from acting earlier, that maintained enough uncertainty about England's alliances and intentions to delay the confrontation until England was better positioned to survive it. Philip II had the resources to attempt an invasion of England in 1570 if he had chosen to. He waited until 1588. That delay was not entirely accidental. Elizabeth's diplomacy was part of why. The Elizabethan era produced what historians call the English Renaissance, the explosion of literary, theatrical, architectural and musical creativity that gave the world Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, William Byrd, and not incidentally William Shakespeare. None of this can be attributed solely to Elizabeth, obviously. Cultural movements are not produced by monarchs, but patronage matters, stability matters. The atmosphere of a court that valued learning and wit and artistic excellence matters. Elizabeth's court provided that atmosphere, and the cultural flowering that resulted left marks on the English language and the English imagination that are still visible today. Now here is the part of Elizabeth's legacy that I think is most interesting and most honest to examine. She did not make things easier for women who came after her. Not directly, not immediately, not in the way that a modern activist or reformer might hope. She did not argue for women's rights. She did not create institutions that expanded opportunities for women. She did not challenge in any systematic way the legal and social structures that constrained women's lives in England and Europe. In fact, she sometimes reinforced those structures. She was capable of dismissing other women's capabilities, of suggesting that her own exceptional qualities set her apart from the general run of her sex in ways that modern readers find uncomfortable, and that feminist historians have rightly criticized. She was a woman of her time in many ways, even as she transcended her time in others. But here is what she did do, and I think it matters more than it is sometimes given credit for. She existed, fully publicly powerfully for 45 years. She occupied the central position in one of the most documented, most observed courts in Europe. And she made it impossible, not for her generation perhaps, but for subsequent generations, to simply assert that women were incapable of sovereign authority without immediately running into the obvious counter-evidence. You cannot argue that women cannot govern when the most powerful monarch in Europe for the last 4 decades of the 16th century was a woman. You can try. People did try. But the argument has a hole in it, the shape of Elizabeth Tudor, and that hole does not close. Think about the women who came after her. Not immediately after the 17th century was not a golden age for female authority, but further out. The pattern of female governance that Elizabeth established tentatively, imperfectly, against enormous resistance became a thread in the fabric of English and then British political culture. Queen Anne in the early 18th century. Queen Victoria in the 19th, whose 63-year reign extended the precedent in ways that reshaped the entire British Empire. Elizabeth II in the 20th and 21st centuries, whose 70 years on the throne made female monarchy seem to her subjects simply normal. None of those queens is Elizabeth Tudor. Each of them governed in circumstances shaped by their own time, but each of them inherited along with the crown the precedent that Elizabeth's reign had established that this was possible, that a woman in this position was not an anomaly requiring apology, but a legitimate expression of how power could be organized. That inheritance is real, it is historical, it is traceable, and it began in November of 1558 with a 25-year-old woman standing in the gardens of Hatfield House, receiving the news that she was queen, quoting a psalm in Latin, with whatever was in her heart. In that moment, joy and terror and relief, and something else, something that had been building for 25 years, and that she would spend the next 45 years expressing through every decision she made. And here is where I want to bring it home, because I think the most enduring thing about Elizabeth's story is not the history. It is the human truth underneath the history. She was a person who was told from before she could speak that she was not quite right, not quite legitimate, not quite what was needed. She was the wrong gender. She was the wrong mother's daughter. She was too Protestant or not Protestant enough. She was too educated or not submissive enough. She was too powerful or not powerful enough. The list of things she was told she was doing wrong was essentially coextensive with the list of things she was doing right. And she governed anyway, for 45 years, without a husband, without an heir, without the structural supports that everyone told her she could not govern without. She built the support she needed out of the materials available to her, her intelligence, her instinct for power, her extraordinary capacity for performance, her hard-won understanding of human nature, and the foundational conviction rooted somewhere in a childhood defined by absence and danger that she was the only person she could ultimately rely on to protect what mattered most. Was she happy? I genuinely do not know. I am not sure happiness is the right measure for a life like hers. What I know is that she was fully herself, more fully, more publicly, more consequentially herself than almost any woman of her era had the opportunity to be. And that fullness of self, that insistence on being the author of her own story, rather than a character in someone else's, is what echoes forward through the centuries in a way that the happiness or unhappiness of individual moments cannot quite diminish. She died on March the 24th, 1603. She was carried through the streets of London to Westminster Abbey, where she was buried. The procession was enormous. Contemporary accounts describe the crowd standing in silence as the coffin passed, which is its own kind of testimony that a city accustomed to celebrating the ends of things, a city with a well-developed taste for public spectacle, chose silence for this one. She had asked at some point to be buried with her sister Mary in the same tomb. The half-sisters, who had been rivals, who had imprisoned each other, who had lived through the same strange and violent world from such different angles, buried together finally in the same stone, partners at the end in a way they had rarely managed in life. There is a Latin inscription on their tomb that translates roughly as partners in throne and grave. Here we sleep Elizabeth and Mary sisters in hope of the resurrection. Partners in throne and grave. It is not the epitaph Elizabeth would have chosen for herself, I suspect. She would have wanted something more singular, more definitive, more her. But there is something right about it too, because Elizabeth's story was never only about her. It was always also about the world she was born into, the constraints she navigated, the expectations she confounded, the people she loved and lost and governed and outlasted. She was singular. She was also deeply, inescapably entangled with everything and everyone around her. That is what makes her human. That is what makes her matter 420 years after her death on a night like this one, when her story is still worth telling and still worth hearing, So here is where I leave you with a question that I think Elizabeth herself would have appreciated, because she always preferred a good question to a tidy answer. What do you do with the things that try to diminish you? Do you let them define you? Do you let them limit you? Or do you find a way your way particular to you, shaped by your own history and your own capabilities, to turn them into the foundation of something larger than what anyone around you thought you were capable of building? Elizabeth Tudor chose the third option. She chose it under circumstances that make our own difficult circumstances look, if I am being entirely honest, relatively manageable. And she held that choice for 45 years through everything the world threw at her, until the morning in Richmond Palace when there was nothing left to hold. That is the story of the Virgin Queen. That is why she never married. That is why 4 centuries later we are still here talking about her. Thank you. Genuinely, sincerely thank you for spending this time with Elizabeth's story and with me. If you made it all the way through this one, you already know that this is not the kind of channel that gives you the quick version. We go deep here because the people we talk about deserve depth, and because you deserve more than a surface reading of the lives that shape the world you live in. If something in Elizabeth's story stayed with you a moment, an image, a question it raised that you are still turning over, I would genuinely love to know. Leave it in the comments. Tell me which part surprised you most, or which part you disagreed with, or which part made you think about your own life in a way you didn't expect. Those conversations are honestly my favourite part of doing this. And if you want to make sure you don't miss what's coming next, because the next story is one that I have been wanting to tell for a long time, and it involves a figure who was in their own way just as extraordinary and just as misunderstood as Elizabeth, in a completely different corner of history, then you know what to do. Subscribe, hit the bell, stay close. The next story is already waiting, and I promise it is worth the wait.
Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we are going to take a slow walk back in time to a quiet corner of medieval life, far away from the bustle of towns and markets, into the gentle, warm space of a humble cottage. Imagine a small home made of wood and stone, its roof thatched with golden straw, a soft, uneven path leading up to the door, and smoke curling lazily from the chimney, a sign of life and warmth inside. Take a deep breath in and imagine the scent of burning wood mixed with the earthy smell of the surrounding fields. Outside, the sun is beginning to set, the light turning soft and golden, brushing across the small garden that hugs the walls of the cottage. You can almost hear the faint sound of leaves moving in a gentle breeze, birds returning to their nests, and the soft murmur of a distant stream. Step slowly through the wooden doorway, and you will notice the interior is simple, practical, and yet comforting. The walls are rough, but they hold a quiet charm. The floor made of packed earth, and in one corner a small hearth, ready for warmth and light. The furniture is minimal, a sturdy table in the center, a few chairs, and shelves with earthenware bowls, wooden utensils, and small bundles of herbs hanging to dry. The cottage feels alive, but in a calm, steady way, a reflection of the rhythm of life outside, in the fields and forests beyond. Let's take a moment to imagine ourselves here, moving slowly through the space, letting our eyes linger on the soft glow of the hearth, the shadows it casts across the walls, the gentle flicker of firelight that dances on the low ceiling. As the night grows quiet, let us move to another part of life in this cottage, the day-to-day moments that make up a simple, peaceful existence, the daily routines that would fill the hours with gentle purpose and quiet satisfaction. Imagine waking slowly with the first light of dawn, the sky painted in soft pinks and pale golds, and the air carrying the crisp, cool scent of morning dew. Outside, birds begin their quiet songs, greeting the new day, and somewhere in the distance a dog barks softly, a signal that the village or neighboring cottages are also stirring. Inside the cottage, the family rises from simple straw-filled mattresses. The beds are low but warm, wrapped in thick, hand-woven blankets, providing comfort through the chill of early morning. There is no rush here, no urgent alarms, just the gentle call of the day, carried by sunlight and the rhythm of life itself. The first task of the day is often the hearth, the fire that will cook the morning meal and keep the home warm. Imagine a parent or older sibling carefully tending to the coals, adding kindling, coaxing flames to life, the gentle crackle filling the quiet room. The smell of smoke mingles with the sweet aroma of bread dough rising, or perhaps porridge simmering slowly in a clay pot. As breakfast is prepared, other chores begin quietly around the cottage. A small garden outside needs attention, watering the herbs, checking the vegetables, collecting eggs from a few clucking hens. There is a calm, steady rhythm to every movement, each task performed with care, without hurry, and always with a sense of purpose. Children may awaken soon, their footsteps soft on the earth floor, and their voices still hushed, speaking in whispers as they join their parents in small tasks. Some carry water from a nearby well, the wooden bucket swinging gently from hand to hand, while others fetch kindling for the fire or help prepare simple food for the day. The day unfolds slowly, each hour marked by small, meaningful activities. Perhaps one family member mends clothes, stitching by hand under the soft morning light, the thread pulling gently through rough fabric, the hands steady and practiced. Another might knead dough, the rhythmic motion calming, almost meditative, shaping it carefully before placing it to rise. Mid-morning is a time for tending animals or venturing briefly into the fields. Imagine walking through tall, swaying grasses, the scent of earth and growing things all around, sheep grazing quietly, cows lowing softly in the distance, and the sound of a gentle breeze moving through the trees, carrying a sense of peace and timelessness. Even the work has its quiet pleasures, collecting eggs, milking a goat, chopping firewood. Each action is simple, yet satisfying, a connection to the world outside the cottage walls. The family moves together in this rhythm, speaking in soft tones, laughter light and fleeting, the day passing slowly but fully. As the sun climbs higher, the warmth fills the cottage, the shadows retreat, and the home feels cozy in its quiet activity. Midday meals are simple, often bread, cheese, or vegetables, eaten slowly with attention to taste and gratitude for the work that has gone into producing them. Sometimes a small treat, honey or fresh fruit, brings a gentle sweetness to the day. After lunch, there is a time for rest or quiet activity, children playing softly nearby, adults pausing to sit and reflect, perhaps repairing tools, weaving baskets, or spinning thread. Even leisure is calm and purposeful, a time to watch clouds drift lazily across the sky, or to listen to the faint rustle of leaves outside the window, each moment a quiet thread woven into the fabric of daily life. As the afternoon stretches on, the work of the day slows, and preparations for evening begin. The hearth is tended again, water drawn from the well for cooking and washing, animals fed for the night, and the family gathers, always gently, for shared tasks and conversation. There is a sense of satisfaction here, a quiet joy in the completion of the day's labors, and a gentle readiness for the evening that approaches softly like the fading light through a small window. Imagine the aroma of bread fresh from the oven, warm and comforting, filling the small cottage, curling gently around the corners of the room. It is a scent of home that signals nourishment and care, the reward of quiet, steady work. Meals in a medieval cottage are simple, but each is prepared with attention and thought. Picture a small table, rough and wooden, yet solid and welcoming, set with clay bowls, wooden spoons, and small mugs. There is a sense of ritual here, the act of eating together, of sharing the fruits of labor, however modest they may be. Breakfast might be porridge, oats or barley simmering slowly in water or milk, sweetened with a touch of honey if it is available, or perhaps a small piece of cheese or bread. The family gathers quietly, speaking in soft tones, savoring the warmth and energy the meal provides. Every bite is slow, deliberate, a moment of calm before the work of the day begins in earnest. Lunch is often taken in the fields for those who are working outside, bread wrapped in cloth, a few vegetables, perhaps a boiled egg, or a small piece of smoked fish. Imagine eating under the shade of a tree, the wind moving gently through the branches, the distant sound of sheep or cows nearby, and the world feeling peaceful, wide, and safe. Evening is the heart of the day for food, the time when the family gathers in the warmth of the hearth. Soup is common, made from seasonal vegetables, flavored with herbs and occasionally thickened with grains. Sometimes a stew of meat or fish joins the meal, its aroma inviting, comforting, drawing everyone close to the fire. Bread is always present, hand-shaped and baked over coals, soft in the middle, slightly crisp at the edges, perfect for dipping into soup or soaking up gravy. And sometimes there is a treat, a spoonful of honey, a few berries from the garden, or a small cake made for special occasions. These moments are gentle joys, small but deeply satisfying. Eating is not hurried. It is a time to pause, to enjoy the warmth of companionship, to listen to the soft crackle of the fire, to feel the safety and calm of a home that is simple, steady, and full of care. Imagine children nibbling slowly, adults speaking in soft tones, the quiet comfort of family life settling around the room like a gentle blanket. After the meal, there is often a time for small chores, washing dishes in a wooden basin, wiping the table, putting away food for the next day. Even these tasks are quiet and deliberate, a continuation of the rhythm that shapes life in the cottage, teaching care, patience, and a gentle appreciation for the simple things. As night grows closer, the family may sit by the hearth, quietly, sipping water or herbal tea, perhaps sharing a story or listening to the wind outside. Food has done more than nourish the body. It has brought warmth, togetherness, and a sense of completion to the day. As the evening settles softly over the cottage, the hearth glows warmly, casting gentle shadows across the walls. Let us take a slow walk into another part of life here, the quiet work and crafts that shape each day, and the tender rhythms of family life that fill the home with soft laughter and gentle care. Imagine the hands of the family moving skillfully, repairing tools, weaving baskets, or stitching clothes, each motion slow and deliberate, each movement a thread in the fabric of their daily existence. A basket is woven from reeds collected from the nearby riverbank, the fibers bending under careful fingers, slowly forming a shape that will hold food, eggs, or firewood. The repetition is soothing, the small crackle of reeds rubbing together, adding to the calm of the cottage. Clothing is often homemade, spun from wool or linen, dyed with natural colors from the earth, muted greens, soft browns, gentle yellows, each garment stitched by hand, mended carefully to last through seasons. Picture a mother sitting by the window, the light falling softly on her lap, a child nearby learning to sew, each stitch a quiet lesson in patience and care, the rhythm of the needle almost like a gentle lullaby. Family life in the cottage is slow and steady, yet rich with subtle joys. Children play quietly with handmade toys, small wooden animals or simple dolls, running in the yard under the soft sun, their laughter light and fleeting, carried away by the gentle breeze. Parents guide them gently, teaching skills, sharing stories, and passing on traditions, all in a voice soft enough to blend with the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a flowing stream. Meals, work, and play are intertwined with moments of reflection and rest. Imagine a father sitting with a child on his lap, showing the movement of a tool, explaining the care needed to maintain it, while the child listens attentively, eyes wide, absorbing knowledge that will one day help them in their own small daily routines. There is a patience here, a calmness that passes quietly from one generation to the next. Evening chores are performed slowly, tending the fire, sweeping the floor, feeding the animals one last time, each task completed with gentle care. Outside, the stars begin to appear, small points of light in the deepening sky, while inside, the cottage is filled with warmth, soft conversation, and the scent of herbs drying near the hearth. Clothing for each day is chosen with both practicality and modest care. Woolen tunics for warmth, simple linen for lightness, leather shoes, patched and mended to last, and perhaps a small cloak for chilly mornings. Imagine the soft rustle of fabric as garments are adjusted, the quiet pride in a well-made piece, a reflection of a family's care, patience, and attention to detail. Life here moves at a gentle pace, each day a collection of small, meaningful actions, each evening a time to pause and reflect. Perhaps a quiet song is hummed while mending, a soft story shared as work is completed, the flickering light of the hearth illuminating thoughtful faces, eyes reflecting both effort and contentment. Evening stretches into night, and the family gathers one last time near the warmth of the fire, enjoying a simple meal, a small treat, or a sip of herbal tea, the house calm and still, filled with the satisfaction of a day well lived, the quiet of a home that functions as both shelter and sanctuary. As the night grows deeper outside the cottage and the last traces of daylight fade into a soft, velvety darkness, let us take a slow, gentle journey into the ways people in this small medieval home find joy, comfort, and meaning, the quiet rituals that shape their evenings, and the subtle customs that give life a gentle rhythm. Entertainment is simple but deeply satisfying. Imagine a family gathered near the hearth, the firelight flickering softly across the walls, shadows dancing like whispers, while a parent or older sibling tells a story,
a tale passed down through generations about faraway lands, clever animals, or lessons learned long ago. The children listen with rapt attention, their eyes wide in the flickering glow, leaning closer to catch every word, the soft cadence of the voice weaving a calm spell over the room. Sometimes there is music. Perhaps a small wooden flute is played, or a stringed instrument plucked carefully, its notes gentle, flowing, and almost like a lullaby. Imagine the sound curling through the cottage, mingling with the scent of herbs and the warmth of the hearth, creating a cocoon of calm and contentment. Even a simple song, hummed quietly, carries the same magic, a thread of joy in the quiet fabric of daily life. Customs mark the rhythm of the year and the home, small celebrations that are woven into the seasons. Perhaps a festival of harvest, when a few extra berries or a bit of honey sweetens the table, or a time to bless the hearth before winter, placing herbs in careful patterns or saying a soft prayer of thanks for warmth, food, and safety. Each custom is gentle, slow, and filled with purpose, reminding the family of their connection to the land, to each other, and to the world beyond the cottage walls. Religion is quiet but present, not loud or imposing, a gentle thread running through each day. Imagine kneeling softly on a woven mat, hands folded, whispering words of gratitude or reflection, listening to the stillness of the home and the faint sounds of evening outside. Prayer or meditation here is calm, a way to pause, to reflect, and to find inner peace before night fully descends. It is a moment of connection, both to the unseen and to the rhythm of life that surrounds the cottage. Evening rituals are soothing and slow, lighting the hearth one last time, tidying the small space, arranging blankets and pillows for comfort, preparing for the gentle rest of night. Children are guided to their straw mattresses, tucked in with care, the soft murmur of a story or lullaby accompanying them to sleep, while adults pause to finish any lingering tasks, always moving deliberately, slowly, with attention to quiet and order. Imagine the warmth of the fire casting its glow on soft faces, the gentle creak of the floorboards under careful steps, and the faint scent of herbs, wood smoke, and bread lingering in the air. The cottage breathes with calm life, each flicker of flame, each soft footstep, each hushed word blending into the rhythm of evening. As the night grows still, let us take a long, slow breath, imagining the cottage resting under a star-filled sky. The world outside hushed, the family wrapped in the soft rhythm of sleep. Let your thoughts grow calm, like a gentle stream moving slowly under moonlight, and imagine the warmth of this small home wrapping around you, the soft glow of the hearth lingering in your mind, and the serene beauty of life in a medieval cottage guiding you toward rest. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, carry with you the soft rhythm of daily life, the warmth of simple meals, the gentle hum of work and play, the quiet joys of family, and the slow, steady heartbeat of a home that is full, calm, and alive in the gentlest of ways. Good night, and may your dreams be as peaceful